Some devils don't hide in shadows. They smile in broad daylight, hunt in plain sight, and turn city streets into their personal graveyard. What happens when the person sitting next to you in traffic, buying groceries beside you, smiling at the checkout counter, is calculating which girl to murder next? Welcome to True Crime Headquarters, where the stories get darker and the truth cuts deeper. I'm glad you're here. Tonight, we're diving into 4 chilling stories you don't want to miss. If you enjoy these late-night truths, please like, comment, and subscribe. It helps the channel grow and keeps these stories alive. This is the story of the Doug Clark. Now, relax, take a deep breath, and let's begin. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. We're tracking a predator who transformed Los Angeles into his personal hunting ground. But this wasn't some lurking creature of the night. This was a man who killed in the sunshine, who abducted victims during morning commutes, who made the everyday terrifying. Doug Clark didn't slink through alleyways. He didn't need darkness to conceal his crimes. He needed something far more disturbing, a partner who loved death as much as he did. And when 2 monsters find each other, when 2 broken souls unite in their hunger for blood, the body count doesn't just rise, it explodes. Tonight, we descend into the nightmare of the Sunset Strip killers, where every victim became a trophy, where decapitation became foreplay, and where evil found its perfect match. Douglas Daniel Clark appeared ordinary, devastatingly, dangerously ordinary. Standing in line at any supermarket, sitting beside you at any traffic light, he possessed the kind of forgettable face that became his deadliest weapon. No twisted features, no obvious menace, just a handsome, charismatic man with an easy smile and piercing blue eyes that seemed to promise adventure rather than annihilation. Born in 1948, Clark grew up in a military family, constantly relocating, never establishing roots, never forming genuine connections. His father, a naval officer, moved the family across continents: Pennsylvania, California, Geneva, the Marshall Islands. Each new location meant another school, another set of temporary friends, another opportunity for Clark to reinvent himself, to practice the masks he'd wear throughout his murderous life. But something festered beneath that handsome exterior. Something broken, something hungry. Intelligence became another weapon in his arsenal. Clark wasn't stupid, far from it. He possessed mechanical aptitude, understood systems, could manipulate situations and people with frightening ease. He worked as a factory mechanic, as a security guard, jobs that provided access, opportunity, and the perfect cover for a predator learning his craft. His childhood held dark whispers. Family members would later recall disturbing patterns: cruelty toward animals, sexual precocity, an obsession with domination that manifested early and grew stronger with each passing year. By adolescence, Clark had discovered his twin obsessions: sex and control. Not love, not connection, but the absolute power of reducing another human being to an object, a plaything, something to be used and discarded. Women became targets long before they became victims. Clark moved through relationships with practiced ease, leaving behind a trail of girlfriends who sensed something off, something cold behind those charming smiles. He married young, a union that collapsed under the weight of his increasingly deviant sexual demands. Then another relationship, another failure, another woman who escaped before discovering what lurked beneath the surface. By the late 1970s, Clark had settled in Los Angeles, that sprawling metropolis where anonymity becomes armor, where millions of people move through their days never truly seeing each other, never recognizing the predators walking among them. He worked at the Jergens soap factory in Burbank, maintaining boilers and machinery, a job requiring intelligence and technical skill. His co-workers found him personable, funny even. They shared lunches, exchanged jokes, never suspecting that the man calibrating pressure valves was simultaneously calibrating his approach to murder. Los Angeles in 1980 sprawled vast and indifferent. The Sunset Strip glittered with neon promises. Nightclubs, restaurants, adult entertainment venues where dreams and desperation collided nightly. Young women arrived daily, drawn by Hollywood's false promises, many ending up stranded, vulnerable, working the streets to survive. They became invisible to most citizens, ignored shadows in a city too busy chasing its own reflection. But Doug Clark saw them. He studied them. He fantasized about them. He'd drive his Datsun through the strip's arteries, watching, evaluating, selecting. Not yet ready to act, but preparing, building toward something terrible, something he'd been moving toward his entire life. The restraints of civilized behavior were thinning, the mask beginning to slip. Then came the catalyst, the accelerant that would transform dark fantasy into horrifying reality. Her name was Carol Mary Bundy. If Doug Clark represented the hunter, Carol Bundy embodied the enabler, equally dangerous, equally broken, but in completely different ways. Born in 1942, Bundy's childhood proved nightmarish. Abandoned by her mother, sexually abused by relatives, passed between foster homes and institutions, she learned early that the world offered neither safety nor love. She developed a desperate hunger for affection, for someone to finally see her, want her, choose her above all others. That hunger made her vulnerable. That hunger made her deadly. By the time she met Clark, Bundy had survived multiple failed marriages, had raised and lost children to the system, had endured sexual assaults and psychological trauma that would destroy most people. She worked as a vocational nurse, caring for others while remaining fundamentally broken herself. She wore thick glasses, carried extra weight, possessed none of the conventional attractiveness that might have protected her from predators. But she possessed something else, an absolute willingness to do anything for love. They met in 1980 at the Little Nashville Club in North Hollywood, a country western bar where lonely people gathered to pretend they weren't lonely. Clark, between girlfriends, noticed the dumpy nurse with the desperate eyes. She noticed the handsome mechanic who actually talked to her, who paid attention, who made her feel seen. Their connection proved immediate and catastrophic. Bundy fell completely, obsessively in love. Clark recognized opportunity. Not just a girlfriend, but a partner, someone whose desperation could be weaponized, whose need for approval could be transformed into complicity. He began sharing his fantasies, testing boundaries, watching to see if she'd recoil or lean closer. She leaned closer. Clark spun elaborate tales of his sexual exploits, his desires, his darkest thoughts. Most women would have fled. Bundy moved in with him, bringing her 2 young sons to the small apartment they'd share. She wanted to prove her devotion, to show Clark she could accept him completely, darkness and all. He rewarded that acceptance by pushing further. Clark began describing his fantasy of picking up prostitutes on the Sunset Strip. Not for sex, but for murder. He detailed what he wanted to do to them, how he'd use them, how their deaths would become the ultimate expression of his power and her loyalty. He painted pictures of decapitation, necrophilia, torture. He described violence so extreme it should have triggered every alarm, every survival instinct. Instead, Bundy agreed to help. She didn't resist, didn't question, didn't flee, because in her damaged mind, this represented love. Being chosen, being trusted with his darkest secrets, being essential to his happiness. If murder made him happy, then she'd help him murder. If he wanted to collect heads, she'd help him store them. If he needed to violate corpses, she'd participate. 2 monsters had found each other. 2 broken people had formed a symbiosis of death. Los Angeles had no idea what was coming. The spring of 1980 brought warm nights and lengthening days. The Sunset Strip pulsed with its usual energy. Tourists gawking at famous clubs, aspiring actors waiting tables, prostitutes working corners, all moving through their separate realities in the same physical space. Clark began making practice runs, cruising the Strip in his Datsun, studying the women, learning patterns, identifying the most vulnerable. He understood that prostitutes made perfect victims, transient, often estranged from family, working in a profession that required getting into strangers' cars, frequently reported missing only after weeks or months had passed. Bundy encouraged him, validated him, helped him refine his plans. She suggested locations for disposing bodies. She offered to help lure victims, understanding that a woman in the car would make potential targets feel safer. She transformed from reluctant participant to active collaborator, her desperate need for approval consuming whatever moral boundaries might have once existed. They discussed logistics like other couples discussed vacation plans: where to kill, how to kill, what to do with bodies, how to avoid detection. Clark's mechanical mind applied problem-solving skills to murder, treating it as a system to be perfected, a process to be refined through iteration and experimentation. Bundy purchased a German Luger pistol, ostensibly for protection. The gun would become their primary weapon. In their shared apartment, they played out fantasies, rehearsing violence, pushing boundaries further with each encounter. Bundy participated in increasingly extreme sexual activities, trying to satisfy Clark's voracious appetites, trying to keep him interested, terrified he'd leave her if she didn't provide everything he demanded. But it wouldn't be enough, could never be enough, because Clark's fantasies required real victims, real blood, real death. The final barrier between imagination and action dissolved on a June evening when Clark announced he was ready. Tonight, he told Bundy they'd begin. Tonight, fantasy would become reality. She didn't protest. She kissed him, wished him luck, and waited for him to return. The Sunset Strip killers were about to claim their first victim. June 1980 arrived hot and restless. Los Angeles sprawled beneath smog-filtered sunshine, millions of people pursuing dreams and desperation in equal measure. The Sunset Strip glowed with its particular brand of sleaze and glamour. Neon signs promising adult entertainment, clubs where rock stars and runaways crossed paths, corners where young women sold the only commodity they possessed. Doug Clark cruised slowly, hunting. His first victim's name was Kathy. Just Kathy, one of countless young women working the Strip, existing in that twilight world between visibility and invisibility. Society saw prostitutes as problems to be managed, crimes to be prosecuted, moral failures to be scorned. Clark saw them as opportunities. He pulled up beside her, his easy smile working its magic. Did she want a ride? Want to make some money? She climbed into the passenger seat, negotiating price, unaware she'd just sealed her fate. They drove away from the lights, away from potential witnesses, toward darkness. Clark parked in a remote location, somewhere in the sprawling emptiness that surrounded the city's bright core. The conversation shifted. His tone changed. She recognized danger too late. Clark had already drawn the Luger. The explosion sounded impossibly loud in the confined space. The bullet entered her skull, ending her life instantly, transforming a living, breathing human being into meat and evidence. But for Clark, the murder represented just the beginning. He'd fantasized about this moment for years, imagined the power, the control, the ultimate domination of taking a human life. Reality exceeded his darkest dreams. The rush proved intoxicating. Better than sex, better than drugs, better than anything he'd experienced. He sat there for long minutes, processing the experience, savoring it, committing every sensation to memory. Then he committed his first act of necrophilia, violating the cooling corpse, completing the fantasy that had driven him to murder. Afterward came the practical considerations. He drove to a disposal site, dumped the body like trash, and returned home where Carol Bundy waited eagerly to hear every detail. He described the killing, the power, the satisfaction. She listened raptly, validating his actions, encouraging him, competing for his attention by suggesting ways they could do it together next time. Clark had crossed a line most humans never approach. Having crossed it once, crossing it again became easier. Much easier. Within weeks, Clark killed again. And again. The murders developed a pattern. Young women picked up on the Sunset Strip, driven to remote locations, shot in the head, sexually violated, dumped like garbage. But Clark's depravity escalated rapidly. Killing wasn't enough. Violation wasn't enough. He needed more control, more souvenirs, more proof of his ultimate power over life and death. He decided to start collecting heads. The concept thrilled him. Decapitation represented the ultimate reduction of a human being to an object, a trophy, something to be kept and used according to his desires. He discussed it excitedly with Bundy, who not only agreed but offered to help. She'd use her nursing knowledge to help with the butchery, to figure out the cleanest way to sever heads from bodies. Their next victims would suffer even more grotesque fates. On June 11, 1980, Clark picked up two girls together. Teenagers Gina Morano and Cynthia Chandler, who worked the strip as a pair for safety. Safety proved illusory. Clark convinced them both to get in his car, promising good money for minimal work. They sat trustingly in his Datsun as he drove into darkness. The gun came out. Gina's life ended with a bullet to the brain. Cynthia screamed, tried to flee, received her own death sentence. A bullet transforming her from a living girl with dreams and fears into a corpse. Clark sat breathing heavily, adrenaline screaming through his system, the power of double murder overwhelming his senses. Then he began his butchery. Using a knife he'd brought specifically for this purpose, Clark decapitated both girls. The process proved messier than anticipated. Bone and cartilage resisted, blood sprayed everywhere, the physical reality of dismemberment requiring significant effort. But he persevered, driven by obsession, finally separating two heads from two bodies. He placed the heads in a cooler, like a fisherman storing his catch. The bodies he dumped separately, scattering evidence across Los Angeles' vast geography. Then he drove home, excited to show Carol his prizes. Bundy's reaction when he opened the cooler cemented her place as equal partner in depravity. Rather than recoiling in horror, she marveled at the heads, touched them, helped Clark refrigerate them for later use. She'd fully embraced the madness, become complicit not through coercion but through her twisted understanding of love and loyalty. Over the following days, Clark repeatedly retrieved the heads from refrigeration, using them for sexual gratification, treating severed heads like pornography brought to hideous life. Bundy participated in some of these acts, trying to maintain Clark's interest, trying to prove she could fulfill even his most depraved desires. But darkness had one final escalation. Clark's murder spree continued through the summer. More young women disappeared from the Sunset Strip, picked up, murdered, violated, discarded. He refined his technique, learned from each killing, became more efficient at abduction, murder, and disposal. Karen Jones, 24 years old, became another victim, shot, violated, dumped. Exie Wilson, 20 years old, suffered the same fate. Clark treated her murder with casual indifference, like stopping for groceries on the way home from work. Marnette Comer, 17 years old, disappeared into Clark's orbit and never returned. Her young life ended with a bullet and sexual violation. Her body left in remote terrain where animals would scatter the evidence. The murders developed a horrifying rhythm. Clark would hunt, would kill, would return home to Carol, who'd listen eagerly to every detail, who'd validate and encourage, who'd help plan the next murder. They'd engage in sexual activities fueled by the fresh memory of death. Then Clark would return to work at the factory, performing his job competently, joking with coworkers, maintaining his mask of normalcy. None of his coworkers suspected. None of his casual friends imagined. The handsome, funny mechanic who calibrated boilers was simultaneously collecting human heads, committing necrophilia, turning Los Angeles into his personal slaughterhouse. But Carol Bundy, despite her devotion, began to crack under the pressure. She'd committed to loving Clark completely, to accepting his darkness, to participating in his crimes. But the reality of multiple murders, of severed heads in their refrigerator, of constant fear of discovery, began eroding her already fragile psychological state. She started drinking more heavily. Her work performance deteriorated. She made concerning statements to her coworkers, hinting at dark knowledge, testing whether anyone would believe her if she revealed the truth. Clark sensed her instability. He recognized that Carol, once his greatest asset, had become his greatest liability. Her desperate need for attention, her deteriorating mental state, her increasing recklessness all pointed toward inevitable disaster. The relationship began to fracture. Clark started seeing other women, leaving Carol alone in the apartment with her terrible knowledge. She grew more desperate, more needy, more dangerous. And then Carol made a decision that would begin the unraveling of everything. She decided to commit her own murder, independent of Clark, to prove her devotion, to show him she could be useful, to bind them together through shared guilt. Her target would be someone she knew, someone she'd been involved with, someone whose death she could accomplish without Clark's help. Her target was Jack Murray. Jack Murray made an easy target, emotionally, practically, and physically. The 50-year-old part-time country singer and van repairman had been Carol Bundy's lover before Clark entered her life, and they'd maintained contact even after her relationship with the mechanic began. Murray represented something Clark never could: genuine affection. He'd been kind to Carol, had treated her with respect despite her obvious psychological issues, had provided companionship without demanding the extreme sexual compliance Clark required. But kindness wouldn't save him. Carol's motivations for murdering Murray mixed obsession, jealousy, and a desperate attempt to bind herself permanently to Clark through shared guilt. If she committed her own murder, perhaps Clark would see her as an equal partner rather than a useful tool. Perhaps he'd love her the way she loved him, completely, obsessively, without reservation or limits. On August 11th, 1980, Carol lured Murray to a remote location in Van Nuys, ostensibly for a romantic encounter. He came willingly, unsuspecting, probably looking forward to rekindling their previous connection. Instead, he found death. Carol brought a gun, the same Luger used in Clark's murders. She shot Murray while they sat in his van, the bullet destroying his brain, ending his life instantly. But Carol, attempting to emulate Clark's depravity, didn't stop with murder. She decapitated him. Using a boning knife, Carol sawed through Murray's neck, separating head from body in a grotesque parody of Clark's previous butchery. The process proved difficult. She lacked Clark's strength, and her nursing experience didn't translate to dismemberment of human remains. Blood soaked the van's interior. She struggled with bone and cartilage, eventually succeeding through sheer determination. She placed Murray's head in a plastic bag, cleaned up as best she could, and dumped his body in a remote area. Then she drove to Clark's apartment, excited to show him what she'd accomplished, to prove her devotion through murder. Clark's reaction proved disappointing. Rather than praising her initiative, he grew angry. She'd acted independently, had drawn attention, had increased their risk of discovery. The murder didn't bind them closer. It created distance, increased tension, accelerated their relationship's deterioration. But the damage extended beyond their poisoned partnership. Carol had murdered someone she knew, someone with connections, someone whose disappearance would generate immediate investigation. Unlike the anonymous prostitutes Clark targeted, Murray had family, friends, a life that would be noticed absent. The investigation began almost immediately. Los Angeles Police Department homicide detectives began connecting cases. Multiple young women found shot execution style, often sexually violated, sometimes decapitated. The pattern screamed serial killer, but without clear evidence linking victims, detectives struggled to develop leads. Then Murray's body surfaced. His decapitated corpse, found in a remote area of Van Nuys, carried markers similar to the other murders: execution-style shooting, decapitation, evidence of extreme violence. But unlike the prostitutes, Murray's identity and background provided immediate investigative traction. Detectives began interviewing Murray's associates, including Carol Bundy, whose relationship with the victim quickly emerged. Initially, she appeared helpful, a grieving friend shocked by Jack's murder. She answered questions, provided information, seemed cooperative. But she couldn't maintain the facade. Carol's psychological state deteriorated rapidly under the stress of her crime and her failing relationship with Clark. She started drinking heavily at work, made increasingly bizarre statements to coworkers, hinted at dark knowledge about multiple murders. Her nursing supervisor grew concerned enough to document the disturbing comments. Then Carol made a catastrophic decision. She confessed. On August 11, 1980, the same day as Murray's murder, Carol told coworkers at the Valley Medical Center, where she worked as a vocational nurse, that she'd done something terrible. Over the following days, her statements grew more specific. She mentioned murders, mentioned her boyfriend's involvement, mentioned details that couldn't possibly be public knowledge. One coworker, alarmed by Carol's increasingly erratic behavior and shocking revelations, contacted police. Detectives interviewed Carol, initially treating her statements with skepticism. They'd encountered false confessions before, attention seekers drawn to high-profile crimes. But Carol provided details only the killer could know. She described victims, locations, methods. She implicated Doug Clark, describing his murders, his collection of severed heads, his necrophilia, his obsessive need to dominate and destroy. Detectives moved quickly. They obtained search warrants for Clark's apartment and vehicle. They began surveillance, building their case, preparing to arrest a man they now recognized as one of California's most depraved serial killers. The evidence they recovered exceeded their darkest expectations. On August 13, 1980, police arrested Doug Clark at his workplace. He'd been calibrating boilers at the Juergens factory when detectives arrived, handcuffs ready, Miranda rights prepared. Clark maintained his innocence initially, insisting police had the wrong man, claiming Carol was mentally unstable and fabricating accusations. But the evidence destroyed his denials. Forensic analysis of Clark's Datsun revealed bloodstains matching multiple victims. The cooler he'd used to store severed heads contained biological evidence. His apartment yielded photographs. Clark posing with victims shortly before their murders, grinning at the camera, trophy photos documenting his conquests. Most damning, investigators recovered one of the severed heads from Carol's possession. She'd kept it, stored it, maintained this grotesque souvenir even after their relationship deteriorated. The preserved head provided definitive proof of decapitation, murder, and the perpetrator's identities. Ballistics matched the Luger to multiple murder victims. Witnesses placed Clark with several girls shortly before their disappearances. The pattern became undeniable. Doug Clark had murdered at least 6 young women, had decapitated multiple victims, had engaged in necrophilia, had transformed the Sunset Strip into his personal hunting ground. Carol Bundy's confession provided additional details. She described murders Clark had bragged about but police hadn't yet discovered. She admitted her participation, helping lure victims, disposing of evidence, storing and using severed heads for sexual purposes. She confessed to Murray's murder, taking responsibility for that killing while continuing to implicate Clark in the others. Prosecutors faced an unusual situation. 2 defendants, both culpable, both monstrous, but in different ways. Clark represented the primary killer, the driving force, the predator who'd initiated the murder spree. Bundy represented the enabler, the accomplice, the desperate woman whose need for love had transformed her into a willing participant in serial murder. Both would face justice, but their fates would diverge. News of the arrests generated massive media attention. The Sunset Strip killers dominated headlines, their crimes shocking even in a city accustomed to violence. The brutality of the murders, the decapitations, the necrophilia, the casual disposal of young lives, stunned investigators and public alike. The victims' stories emerged gradually. Most had been young prostitutes, teenagers, and women in their 20s, working the strip to survive. Some had been runaways. Others struggled with addiction. Several had children they'd been trying to support through the only work available. Society had failed them in life, and they'd suffered unspeakable degradation in death. Families grieved publicly, their loss compounded by the horrific manner of death. Parents who'd spent months searching for missing daughters learned their children had been murdered, decapitated, violated, reduced to objects in a madman's fantasy. The case raised uncomfortable questions about prostitution, about society's failure to protect vulnerable women, about the monsters hiding behind ordinary faces. Doug Clark hadn't looked like a serial killer. He'd been handsome, employed, apparently normal. How many other predators walked undetected among the population? Carol Bundy's participation proved equally disturbing. She wasn't coerced. She wasn't threatened. She'd participated willingly, enthusiastically, transforming love into complicity in serial murder. Her case highlighted the dangerous intersection of mental illness, desperate need for affection, and the capacity for evil that exists in ordinary people under extraordinary circumstances. As the legal process began, Los Angeles started to comprehend the full scope of the nightmare that had played out in their city. Doug Clark's trial began in 1982, 2 years after his arrest. Prosecutors faced the challenge of proving multiple murders while navigating complex evidence and a defendant who maintained his innocence despite overwhelming proof. The prosecution built their case methodically. They presented forensic evidence. Bloodstains in Clark's car matching victims, ballistic matches between the murder weapon and bullets recovered from bodies, fiber evidence linking Clark to multiple crime scenes. They showed photographs, Clark posing with victims, grinning at the camera, creating trophies to commemorate his kills. Most powerfully, they presented Carol Bundy's testimony. Bundy had agreed to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for potential leniency. She testified extensively, describing murders in graphic detail, explaining Clark's fantasies and their horrible realization, admitting her own participation while emphasizing Clark's role as the primary killer and instigator. Her testimony proved devastating. She described how Clark would return home after murders, excited and aroused by the killing, eager to share every detail. She explained the decapitations, the collection of heads, the repeated violations of corpses. She admitted helping dispose of evidence, providing alibis, participating in the depravity. Clark's defense attorney attempted to discredit Bundy, portraying her as mentally unstable, attention-seeking, and potentially the primary killer attempting to shift blame. They highlighted her confession to Murray's murder, suggested she'd committed other killings and falsely implicated Clark, but the physical evidence corroborated Bundy's testimony. The victim's blood in Clark's car, the murder weapon in Bundy's possession, the photographs, the forensic links. Every piece of evidence pointed toward Clark as the Sunset Strip killer, with Bundy as his willing accomplice. The trial became a media sensation. Court observers packed the gallery daily, fascinated and horrified by the revelations. Journalists reported every gruesome detail. The public couldn't look away from this glimpse into absolute depravity. Clark himself proved an interesting defendant. Rather than showing remorse, he displayed arrogance, even pride. He smirked at testimony, made inappropriate jokes, treated the proceedings like performance art. His behavior reinforced prosecution arguments that he was a remorseless psychopath incapable of rehabilitation. The jury deliberated for several days, processing the overwhelming evidence and horrific testimony. On January 28, 1983, they returned guilty verdicts on 6 counts of first-degree murder. The penalty phase began immediately, prosecutors seeking death, defense arguing for life imprisonment. The jury recommended death. The judge concurred. Doug Clark received 6 death sentences, becoming one of California's most notorious condemned inmates. He would spend the rest of his life on death row, aging slowly in San Quentin prison, exhausting appeals, maintaining his innocence despite overwhelming evidence, never showing genuine remorse for the young lives he destroyed. Carol Bundy's legal journey followed a different path. She'd confessed, cooperated with authorities, provided crucial testimony against Clark. Prosecutors had promised consideration in exchange for her cooperation. Bundy pled guilty to 2 counts of murder, Jack Murray's killing and one of the Sunset Strip murders where her participation had been direct and provable. She admitted helping dispose of bodies, storing severed heads, participating in Clark's depravity. But unlike Clark, Bundy expressed remorse. She acknowledged the horror of what she'd done, accepted responsibility, attempted to explain the psychological state that had enabled her participation. Mental health experts testified about her traumatic childhood, desperate need for affection, and the way Clark had exploited her vulnerabilities. The court sentenced Bundy to consecutive terms of 27 years to life. She entered the California Institution for Women at Frontera, becoming just another face in the system, no longer the desperate woman seeking love at any cost, now simply prisoner number W09006. Bundy served her sentence quietly, avoiding publicity, participating in prison programs. She gave occasional interviews, attempting to explain the inexplicable, trying to articulate how a lonely nurse had transformed into a serial killer's accomplice. Her explanations never fully satisfied. How could they? How do you rationally explain participating in decapitation and necrophilia because you wanted someone to love you? In December 2003, Carol Mary Bundy died in prison from heart failure. She was 61 years old, having spent 23 years incarcerated, having never again experienced freedom after those nightmare months in 1980. She died knowing she'd participated in killing young women whose only crime was vulnerability, knowing she'd enabled a monster, knowing love had become her excuse for unconscionable evil. Amid the sensational trial coverage and psychological analysis of the killers, the victims themselves risked becoming footnotes, names in court documents, bodies in morgue photographs, evidence in a sensational trial. But they were people. They had lives, dreams, families, futures that Clark and Bundy stole. Gina Morano was 15 years old, a runaway trying to survive on the Strip. She'd left home fleeing abuse, only to find worse horror in Clark's car. Cynthia Chandler was 16, working the streets to feed herself, dreaming of eventual escape. She died beside her friend, both teenagers murdered together. Karen Jones was 24, struggling with addiction but working toward recovery. Her family spent weeks searching before learning she'd been murdered. Exie Wilson was 20, intelligent and artistic despite her circumstances. She'd hoped to return to school eventually to build a legitimate life. Marnette Comer was 17, the youngest victim, barely more than a child. She'd run away from foster care, seeking freedom and finding death. Kathy, her last name lost to incomplete records, remains semi-anonymous, a young woman whose full story died with her. Their families mourned publicly and privately. Parents organized vigils. Siblings demanded justice. Friends testified about the vibrant people these young women had been before Clark reduced them to victims in his sexual fantasies. Several families advocated for increased protection of sex workers, arguing that society's indifference to prostitutes had enabled Clark's killing spree. They demanded recognition that their daughters, despite their profession, deserved safety, deserved investigation when they disappeared, deserved to be treated as human beings rather than disposable problems. Their advocacy contributed to gradual changes in law enforcement's approach to crimes against sex workers, though progress remained frustratingly slow. The victims deserve remembrance beyond their horrible deaths. They were daughters, sisters, friends, people with histories and potential futures. Clark and Bundy destroyed not just 6 lives, but all the possibilities those lives contained. Doug Clark remains on death row at San Quentin State Prison, now in his mid-70s, having spent over 4 decades awaiting execution that may never come. California's death penalty exists in legal limbo. Sentences handed down but rarely carried out, inmates aging and dying from natural causes before the state executes them. Clark has exhausted most appeals. Courts have consistently upheld his conviction, finding the evidence overwhelming and the trial fair. He continues maintaining innocence, claiming Carol Bundy framed him, insisting he's the victim of a mentally unstable woman's fabrications. No one believes him. The evidence, physical, testimonial, photographic, destroys any credibility his denials might have possessed. Over the years, Clark has given occasional interviews, displaying the same arrogance and lack of remorse that characterized his trial behavior. He seems to enjoy the attention, the notoriety, the opportunity to remain relevant through his infamy. He manipulates journalists, drops hints about additional victims, plays psychological games with investigators and observers. True crime writers and researchers periodically examine his case, attempting to understand what creates a serial killer, what enables someone to commit such extreme violence. Clark provides few real answers. He enjoys the mystery, the attention, the power of withholding information. He'll likely die in prison from age or illness. His death sentences never carried out, his full victim count possibly never known. Some investigators believe Clark killed more than 6 women, pointing to unsolved murders during his active period that match his methodology. Clark neither confirms nor denies, maintaining ambiguity as a final expression of control. The Sunset Strip killer case influenced law enforcement approaches to serial murder investigations. Detectives learned the importance of connecting seemingly unrelated cases, of looking for patterns in murders of marginalized victims, of treating prostitutes' disappearances with the same urgency as other missing persons reports. The case highlighted how serial killers often target society's most vulnerable members: prostitutes, runaways, addicts. Knowing their disappearances generate less immediate investigation and public concern. This recognition led to improved protocols and dedicated resources for investigating crimes against sex workers. Psychologically, the case provided insights into folie à deux, shared psychosis between two people. Clark and Bundy's relationship demonstrated how one person's pathology can enable and amplify another's, creating something more dangerous than either individual alone. Their partnership showed how desperate need for acceptance can override moral boundaries, how love can become a weapon in the wrong hands. The case also reinforced uncomfortable truths about the ordinariness of evil. Clark didn't look like a monster. He worked a regular job, maintained friendships, passed through society without triggering obvious alarm. The predators among us don't announce themselves. They smile, joke, appear normal while calculating which victim to target next. This ordinariness makes them more dangerous, not less. If serial killers looked like monsters, we could identify and avoid them. But they look like everyone else: the mechanic at work, the person in line at the grocery store, the driver in the next lane. Recognition requires vigilance, awareness, and the unsettling acknowledgement that evil doesn't advertise itself. Los Angeles' Sunset Strip continues operating today, still glittering with neon, still attracting the ambitious and desperate, still hosting the complicated intersection of dreams and darkness that defines that strange stretch of American landscape. The clubs have changed names, the fashions have evolved, but vulnerable young women still work corners, still get into strangers' cars, still risk everything to survive. The nightmare of 1980 faded into history, another horrible case among countless horrible cases, remembered by investigators, families, true crime enthusiasts, and those who understand that monsters walk among us wearing ordinary faces. Doug Clark hunted the vulnerable and turned a city's bright arteries into his killing ground. Carol Bundy loved a monster and became one herself. 6 young women died terrible deaths because 2 broken people found each other and transformed mutual darkness into mass murder. Their story ends not with resolution but with grim reality. Clark aging on death row, the victims long buried, the strip still glowing with its particular promises and dangers, and the uncomfortable knowledge that somewhere, right now, another predator is hunting, another vulnerable person is at risk, and society remains imperfect at preventing the next nightmare before it begins. The Sunset Strip killers proved that evil doesn't announce itself. Smiles, jokes, and kills, and sometimes it finds a partner. If you're new here, welcome to the channel, where we dive into true crime stories with calmness and respect. A special shout out to my amazing subscribers who've been with me from the start. Thank you for your incredible support. If you're still with me, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. Or just say hello so I know you're still here. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and hit subscribe so you won't miss any of our upcoming true crime stories perfect for winding down. Now, let's move on to our second story. Story 2, the Clark case. The mailman found something that would haunt him for the rest of his life, and by then, Vernon Lee Clark had already vanished into a nightmare of his own making. What happens when the person you trust most becomes the architect of your destruction? Tonight, we're tracking a predator who didn't just destroy lives. He erased them, piece by piece, until nothing remained but questions and unmarked graves. But when the hunters closed in, Vernon Lee Clark discovered that some monsters can't outrun their own shadows. Vernon Lee Clark wasn't supposed to be a monster. In the suffocating heat of small-town America, he was the man who smiled at church socials, the neighbor who waved from his perfectly manicured lawn, the face that blended seamlessly into the fabric of ordinary life. But behind that mask of normalcy, something ancient and hungry was stirring, something that fed on trust and thrived in darkness. The investigation began not with screams or blood, but with silence. A silence so profound, so absolute, that it swallowed entire lives whole. When Sarah Mitchell failed to show up for her shift at the county hospital 3 days in a row, her co-workers assumed illness, perhaps a family emergency. When her apartment was found locked from the outside, still decorated with birthday cards she'd never opened, the assumptions crumbled into dust. The cards were dated 2 months prior. Nobody had seen her since, but Sarah wasn't the first. She was simply the first one people noticed was missing. The town of Millbrook had always been the kind of place where people disappeared slowly, gradually, their absences explained away by convenient stories. Moved away for work, reconciled with a estranged family, started fresh somewhere new. The human mind craves narrative, demands explanation, and Millbrook's residents were happy to provide both. They didn't want to believe that something was feeding on them from within, that the disease had already metastasized through their community like cancer through bone. Vernon Lee Clark understood this better than anyone. He'd spent 43 years studying the architecture of human denial, mapping its weak points, learning exactly how much pressure it could withstand before collapsing. He knew that people would rather believe comfortable lies than confront uncomfortable truths. He knew that loneliness made people vulnerable, that isolation was a weapon sharper than any blade. Most importantly, he knew that society's forgotten people, the elderly living alone, the addicts struggling through recovery, the mentally ill navigating a world that had abandoned them, could disappear without causing ripples. He chose his victims with the precision of a surgeon selecting precisely where to cut. Detective Maria Santos didn't believe in monsters, not the supernatural kind anyway. She'd spent 18 years with the state police witnessing what humans were capable of inflicting on each other, and she knew that the real monsters walked on 2 legs, paid taxes, and sometimes even volunteered at soup kitchens. When the Sarah Mitchell case landed on her desk alongside 3 other missing persons reports spanning the previous 14 months, something cold settled into her stomach. The instinct that separates good investigators from great ones, the ability to see patterns where others see only chaos. The files told stories of erasure. Marcus Webb, a 56-year-old veteran struggling with PTSD, last seen leaving a Veterans Affairs counseling session, disappeared like smoke in wind. Linda Ortega, recovering addict 7 months sober, working double shifts to regain custody of her daughter, vanished between her evening job and her night job, a 6-block walk she'd made hundreds of times before. Robert Chun, 74 years old, widower, his only son living 3,000 miles away and too busy to visit. Gone from his morning walk, his dog found wandering 3 blocks from home, leash still attached, whimpering. For people with almost nothing in common except geography and vulnerability. For people whose absences were initially explained away. For people who trusted someone enough to get close. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A gas station security camera positioned to capture the pumps, but which also caught a sliver of the adjacent parking lot. The footage was grainy, pixelated, the kind of low-quality digital recording that makes identification nearly impossible. But on the night Linda Ortega disappeared, the camera caught her crossing that parking lot at 11:47 p.m., her purse slung over her shoulder, phone pressed to her ear. She was smiling. 43 seconds later, a dark sedan pulled into frame. The driver's face was obscured by the camera angle, but his actions were clear. He stepped out, approached Linda, and they spoke for 92 seconds. She nodded. She got into his car willingly, even waving goodbye to someone she'd been speaking with on the phone. Her sponsor, investigators later confirmed, who reported that Linda had said she'd just run into an old friend who was offering her a ride home. The car's license plate was partially visible. It took investigators 6 days to trace it through traffic cameras across 3 counties. The vehicle was registered to Vernon Lee Clark, a 43-year-old social worker employed by the county's Department of Human Services. A social worker, someone whose entire professional life revolved around helping vulnerable people. Someone with access to confidential files, medical histories, home addresses. Someone who knew exactly which of his clients lived alone, struggled with addiction, suffered from mental illness, had minimal family contact. Someone who could enter their lives without raising suspicion, who could offer help and support and kindness, who could build trust slowly and methodically before striking. The realization hit the investigation team like a hammer to glass. They weren't hunting a stranger lurking in shadows. They were hunting someone who'd been invited into these people's lives. Someone they trusted explicitly. Someone whose job was literally to protect them. When Detective Santos and her team executed the search warrant on Clark's residence, a modest two-bedroom house on Elm Street with wind chimes on the porch and rose bushes in the front yard, they expected evidence. They found a mausoleum. The house was immaculate, almost obsessively so. Every surface gleamed. Every item had its designated place. The refrigerator contained precisely labeled containers organized by date. The living room featured family photos. Clark with his elderly mother, Clark at a work Christmas party, Clark receiving an employee recognition award. Normal, aggressively, performatively normal. But the basement told a different story entirely. The stairs descended into darkness that seemed to have weight and texture, darkness that swallowed flashlight beams and muffled sound. The air tasted wrong, chemical sweetness underlaid with something organic and rotting, a combination that triggered primal revulsion in everyone who breathed it. The basement had been soundproofed meticulously, the walls covered in layers of acoustic foam and insulation. A drain had been installed in the concrete floor, leading to pipes that bypassed the main sewage system entirely, emptying instead into a septic tank buried deep in the backyard. In the corner, behind a false wall that required removing 3 heavy shelving units to access, they found what Vernon Lee Clark had been hiding. The room was 12 feet by 12 feet, windowless, the walls covered in plastic sheeting that had been changed so many times the floor beneath showed permanent staining. Shackles were bolted into the concrete, their metal surfaces scarred and scratched. A video camera sat on a tripod in the corner, its lens pointed toward the center of the room, its memory card containing footage that would later require psychological counseling for every investigator forced to review it. But Vernon Lee Clark wasn't there. The house was empty. The monster had already fled. The manhunt began at 4:47 a.m. when the search warrant team radioed for backup and every available unit. Within hours, Vernon Lee Clark's face was on every news channel, every social media platform, every law enforcement database in North America. His employee photo from the Department of Human Services stared out from televisions and smartphones. A middle-aged man with thinning hair and wire-rimmed glasses, the kind of unremarkable face that disappears in crowds, that triggers no alarm bells, that people forget 5 minutes after meeting. That face was now the most wanted in 3 states. But finding Vernon Lee Clark would prove more difficult than anyone anticipated. This wasn't a criminal who'd acted impulsively, who'd left a trail of mistakes and oversights. This was someone who'd been planning for this moment, preparing for eventual discovery with the same meticulous attention he'd applied to every other aspect of his crimes. His bank accounts had been systematically drained over the previous 6 months. Small withdrawals that avoided triggering automatic reporting requirements converted to prepaid debit cards and cryptocurrency. His phone had been disabled, its last ping placing him 40 miles west of Millbrook 30 minutes before the search warrant was executed. Just enough time to disappear if he'd been monitoring police activity, which investigators now believed he had been. He'd prepared a go bag, investigators discovered, finding the empty space in his closet where it had been stored, dust patterns on the shelf revealing its rectangular outline. He'd researched disappearing techniques, his computer history showing deleted searches for facial recognition evasion, crossing borders without documentation, living off-grid in remote areas. He'd been ready for this day, perhaps had been ready for years, treating his eventual exposure not as a question of if but when. Detective Santos assembled a task force drawing from FBI behavioral analysts, state police investigators, and local law enforcement across multiple jurisdictions. They built a profile of Vernon Lee Clark that went beyond the surface-level social worker persona he'd constructed. They interviewed his co-workers, who described him as dedicated but distant, competent but cold, someone who'd worked in the department for 11 years without forming a single genuine friendship. They spoke with his neighbors, who reported that he was polite but private, that he'd lived in the house for 8 years, and they couldn't recall ever having a substantive conversation with him. His mother, contacted at a nursing home in a neighboring state, hadn't spoken with him in 7 months despite his regular payments for her care. Vernon Lee Clark had constructed an entire life designed to avoid scrutiny. No close relationships meant no one asking questions. No social media presence meant no digital trail. No hobbies or interests beyond work meant no community connections. He'd made himself invisible while hiding in plain sight, a ghost wearing human skin. The forensic analysis of his basement chamber revealed the true scope of his horrors. The plastic sheeting contained trace DNA from at least 11 different individuals. The video camera's storage drive, when finally accessed by digital forensic specialists, contained footage spanning 7 years, footage of torture, degradation, and ultimately murder, each victim subjected to weeks or sometimes months of captivity before their deaths. The footage was methodically organized, labeled by date and victim name, edited and cataloged like someone curating a personal film collection. Vernon Lee Clark hadn't just killed these people. He documented their destruction, preserved their suffering, creating a library of agony that he could revisit whenever he desired. The manhunt intensified when investigators discovered his vehicle abandoned in a long-term parking lot at the regional airport. Security footage showed him entering the lot 3 days before the search warrant, parking the car, and leaving on foot carrying a large backpack. He'd purchased a bus ticket using cash to a city 400 miles away, then disappeared into urban anonymity. From there, the trail went cold. But Detective Santos had one advantage that Clark couldn't have anticipated. She understood that predators like him couldn't stop. The compulsion that drove him to torture and kill wasn't something that could be suppressed indefinitely, wasn't something that disappeared just because circumstances had changed. He would need to feed that hunger again, and when he did, he would make a mistake. The task force expanded the investigation, looking for patterns in unsolved missing persons cases across the country. They found 17 cases spanning 5 states and 12 years, all vulnerable individuals, all disappeared without trace, all within 100 miles of places Vernon Lee Clark had lived or visited. The realization was staggering. He'd been doing this since his mid-20s, refining his techniques across more than a decade, leaving a trail of destruction that stretched back through multiple jurisdictions, none of which had connected the disappearances until now. They publicized this information carefully, releasing enough details to warn potential victims while withholding specific investigative techniques. The media coverage was unprecedented. Vernon Lee Clark's face became synonymous with evil. His name joined the pantheon of serial killers who'd shocked the nation. Thousands of tips flooded law enforcement hotlines. Most led nowhere. Some led to dead ends. But one, received 6 weeks into the manhunt, changed everything. A homeless shelter worker in a city 800 miles from Millbrook called to report that a volunteer matching Clark's description had been coming to the shelter for the past 3 weeks. He'd given a false name, grown a beard, dyed his hair, lost weight, but there was something about his eyes, something cold and calculating that had triggered the worker's instinct that something was wrong. When she'd seen the news coverage, the recognition was instant. The task force mobilized with surgical precision. They couldn't risk warning him, couldn't afford to let him disappear again. They placed the shelter under surveillance, confirmed the volunteer's identity through covert photography and facial recognition software that cut through his physical alterations. Vernon Lee Clark had done exactly what Santos predicted. He'd gravitated back toward vulnerable populations, couldn't resist the proximity to potential victims, thought he could blend into the community of those trying to help the homeless while simultaneously hunting among them. The arrest was planned for early morning, before his volunteer shift began, when he'd be isolated and unsuspecting. 24 federal and state law enforcement officers participated, forming perimeters, establishing sniper positions, preparing for every contingency. They'd learned from other high-profile arrests gone wrong. They would take no chances. To 5:23 a.m., Vernon Lee Clark emerged from the boarding house where he'd been staying, wearing the same unremarkable clothing that had allowed him to disappear into crowds for 6 weeks. He was walking toward the bus stop when the tactical team converged, weapons drawn, voices shouting commands, the morning silence shattered by the machinery of justice finally catching up to him. For the first time since the investigation began, Vernon Lee Clark showed genuine emotion. Not fear, not remorse, but rage. Pure, incandescent fury that he'd been caught, that his carefully constructed new identity had failed, that his hunting would be interrupted. He lunged toward the nearest officer not in surrender but in attack, his hand reaching for something in his jacket pocket. The officer's shot was clean. Vernon Lee Clark went down hard on the pavement, his blood spreading across concrete still damp with morning dew. The object in his pocket was a knife, a folding blade, well-maintained, the same type he'd used on his victims. Even in capture, he'd been seeking one final kill. He survived the gunshot wound. Within hours, he was in federal custody, facing charges that would guarantee he'd never breathe free air again. Vernon Lee Clark sat across from Detective Santos in the interrogation room, his shoulder bandaged, his wrists shackled to the table, his expression utterly devoid of emotion. He'd waived his right to an attorney, a decision that confused his public defender but delighted prosecutors. He wanted to talk. He'd been waiting to talk, Santos realized, perhaps for years. The isolation of his crimes had been both shield and prison, and now that the shield was gone, he seemed almost relieved to finally share the truth of what he was. The interrogation lasted 14 hours across 3 days. What emerged was a portrait of evil so banal, so human, that it was somehow more terrifying than any supernatural horror could ever be. Vernon Lee Clark had discovered his compulsion at age 16. A neighbor's cat had wandered into his yard, and he'd captured it, experimented on it, discovered that causing suffering produced a neurochemical response in his brain unlike anything he'd experienced before. The cat disappeared. No one noticed. The lesson was learned. Some lives didn't matter to anyone, and those lives could be taken without consequence. He'd studied psychology in college not despite his urges, but because of them. He wanted to understand the mechanics of predation, the psychology of victims, the ways that society structured itself to protect some people while abandoning others. His academic work was exemplary. His professors remembered him as brilliant but emotionally disconnected, someone who discussed human suffering with clinical detachment that sometimes bordered on inappropriate but never quite crossed into alarming. The social work position was perfect. It gave him access, authority, and most importantly, cover. He spent years working legitimately, helping people, building a reputation as dedicated and reliable. But he was always watching, always cataloging, identifying which clients would make suitable victims. He looked for specific markers: minimal family contact, histories of substance abuse or mental illness that made their behavior seem erratic to others, financial instability that meant frequent moving, social isolation that meant few people would notice their absence. His first human victim was a 52-year-old woman named Patricia Donovan. She'd been his client for 6 months, struggling with alcoholism and depression after her husband's death. Clark had helped her apply for benefits, had driven her to appointments, had slowly become the only consistent person in her life. When he offered to help her move to a new apartment, she accepted gratefully. She never made it to that apartment. The basement chamber became her tomb for 3 weeks before he killed her, and her death taught him what the cat had suggested years earlier. He could make people disappear, and nobody would look hard enough to find them. Detective Santos forced herself to remain professional as Clark described each victim with chilling specificity. He remembered their names, their fears, their final words. He described his techniques for establishing trust, for isolating victims, for ensuring their disappearances would be minimally investigated. He explained how he'd chosen victims across multiple jurisdictions to avoid pattern recognition, how he'd varied his methods to prevent forensic connections, how he'd studied serial killer cases to avoid their mistakes. He showed no remorse, none. When Santos asked if he felt anything about the suffering he'd caused, he looked genuinely puzzled by the question. as if she'd asked him to feel bad about breathing. The suffering was the point, he explained. The suffering was what made him feel alive, what filled the emptiness inside him that had existed as long as he could remember. Without it, he was hollow. With it, he was complete. The confessions allowed investigators to locate remains. Clark had been methodical about disposal, using remote areas across multiple states, burying victims deep in forests and abandoned properties, sometimes dissolving bodies in industrial chemicals purchased through legitimate work channels. Over the following months, forensic teams recovered 17 sets of remains. DNA analysis would take years to identify all of them, but families finally had answers, had places to mourn, had endings to stories that had hung suspended in agonizing uncertainty. But even as Clark confessed to murder after murder, there was one case he refused to discuss. Sarah Mitchell, the hospital worker whose disappearance had triggered the investigation. When Santos pressed him on this, his expression changed. The first genuine emotion he'd shown beyond rage at his capture. He smiled. It was a terrible smile, knowing and cruel, the expression of someone holding a final secret. Sarah, he said slowly, is different. Sarah is special. You'll never find her, detective. She's my masterpiece, my greatest work. Long after I'm gone, she'll still be out there, waiting. My legacy. Santos felt ice water replace the blood in her veins. The implication was clear. Sarah Mitchell might still be alive, might be suffering somewhere even now, held in a location Clark had prepared specifically for this scenario. A final victim, a final act of cruelty that would haunt investigators long after his conviction. They interrogated him for hours more, using every technique available. Promises, threats, appeals to ego, suggestions that other killers had solved their legacies. Clark refused to budge. Sarah Mitchell's location would remain his secret. He insisted, his final victory over the investigators who'd caught him. The legal proceedings moved forward with unusual speed. The evidence was overwhelming. The basement chamber, the video footage, the confessions, the remains. Clark's attorney mounted no real defense, arguing instead for life imprisonment rather than execution on grounds that his client's psychological condition made him less than fully culpable. The jury deliberated for 97 minutes before returning guilty verdicts on 17 counts of first-degree murder. The sentencing hearing brought together families of victims for the first time. They filled the courtroom, dozens of people whose lives had been shattered by Vernon Lee Clark's actions. They read impact statements describing the destruction he'd caused. Not just the deaths of their loved ones, but the years of uncertainty before the truth emerged, the nightmares that still plagued them, the pieces of themselves that had died alongside the victims. Clark sat through it all with the same emotionless expression, barely seeming to register the pain surrounding him. When offered the chance to make a statement before sentencing, he declined. He had nothing to say to these people. Their suffering didn't interest him anymore. The judge sentenced him to 17 consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole. In states where he'd committed murders that carried death penalty provisions, prosecutors were preparing additional cases, though Clark would likely die of old age in prison long before any execution could be carried out. Justice had been served in the technical sense. The killer was caught, convicted, would spend the remainder of his life in a maximum security facility. But Sarah Mitchell was still missing. Despite searches of properties Clark had owned or visited, despite analysis of his financial records for clues about hidden locations, despite offers of reduced sentences in exchange for information, her whereabouts remained unknown. Detective Santos became obsessed with finding her, devoting every spare moment to reviewing evidence, following increasingly desperate leads, hoping for the breakthrough that would bring Sarah home. 3 months after Clark's conviction, that breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Clark's mother, dying of cancer in the nursing home her son had paid for with money earned through legitimate work even as he murdered people in his spare time. She called Santos from her deathbed, her voice barely above a whisper. "He has a storage unit," she said, "under a false name. He made me promise never to tell anyone. But I can't die with this secret. The address is..." The address led to a self-storage facility 80 miles from Millbrook, paid for 10 years in advance under a name that didn't exist in any database. Unit 237. climate-controlled, soundproofed. When SWAT teams breached the door, they found Sarah Mitchell alive, barely, sustained by automated feeding systems and medical equipment that Clark had installed specifically for long-term captivity. She'd been imprisoned for 4 months in a space measuring 6 feet by 8 feet, kept in drugged semi-consciousness. Her suffering extended indefinitely according to Clark's meticulous design. She survived. The physical recovery took months. The psychological recovery would take the rest of her life. Vernon Lee Clark's final secret had been exposed. His masterpiece had been rescued. His legacy would not be the suffering he'd hoped for, but the justice that had caught him and the survivors who refused to let his evil define them. The Vernon Lee Clark case sent shockwaves through every system it touched. The Department of Human Services underwent complete restructuring, implementing new oversight protocols, mandatory psychological evaluations for employees with direct client access, and whistleblower protections for anyone reporting concerning behavior. The reforms came too late for Clark's victims, but they might prevent future predators from exploiting the same vulnerabilities in the system that he had weaponized so effectively. Detective Santos received commendations from multiple agencies, but the accolades felt hollow. She'd caught the killer, yes, but 17 people were still dead, and Sarah Mitchell would carry physical and psychological scars for the remainder of her life. The victory, such as it was, tasted like ashes. She'd learned what every investigator eventually discovers. You can't bring back the dead, can't undo the suffering, can only try to prevent the next horror from occurring. The families of victims struggled with complicated grief. Some found closure in knowing the truth, in having remains to bury, in seeing their loved one's killer face justice. Others found the details of how their family members died more traumatic than not knowing, wished they could unlearn the specifics of suffering that Clark had inflicted. There was no right way to process this kind of loss, no timeline for healing from wounds this deep. Sarah Mitchell's recovery became a focal point for media coverage, much of it exploitative, treating her survival as feel-good content rather than acknowledging the profound trauma she'd endured. She eventually moved across the country, changed her name, tried to build a life where she wasn't defined by what Vernon Lee Clark had done to her. In rare interviews, she spoke about the importance of recognizing vulnerable populations, of funding mental health services and social safety nets that might prevent people from becoming easy targets for predators. The true crime community became obsessed with the case, as they always do when monsters wear human faces. Podcasts dissected every detail. YouTube channels created multi-part series analyzing Clark's psychology. Amateur investigators proposed theories about potential additional victims, scoured cold cases for connections. Some of this attention helped. Several families whose loved ones had disappeared years earlier finally got answers when investigators connected their cases to Clark's activity patterns. But much of the attention was simply voyeurism, people consuming horror from safe distances, treating real suffering as entertainment. This bothered Detective Santos more than she admitted publicly. These weren't characters in a story. They were real people who'd experienced real terror, whose families were still grieving, who deserved more than being reduced to content for true crime enthusiasts. Vernon Lee Clark himself seemed to enjoy the attention from prison. He gave occasional interviews to journalists who paid for access, always careful to say nothing that might jeopardize his legal appeals, but offering enough hints and suggestions to keep people interested. He transformed from predator to celebrity in certain circles, a phenomenon that spoke to something diseased in modern culture's relationship with violence and evil. He received fan mail. This fact horrified investigators but didn't surprise them. There were always people attracted to notorious killers, people who romanticized evil or convinced themselves they saw hidden humanity in monsters. Clark kept the letters in his cell. Santos learned, reading them repeatedly, feeding on the attention the way he'd once fed on his victim's suffering. Prison officials kept him in administrative segregation for his own protection. Not because they cared about his well-being, but because allowing him into general population would result in his immediate death at the hands of other inmates, and they needed him alive for ongoing investigations. He spent 23 hours a day in a cell measuring 8 by 10 feet, experiencing a fraction of the isolation he'd inflicted on others. Santos hoped he hated every second of it. though she suspected he'd found ways to occupy his mind, replaying his crimes in memory, reliving the suffering he'd caused. The investigation officially closed 17 months after Clark's arrest. All identified victims accounted for, all evidence processed, all available charges filed. But Detective Santos couldn't let it go completely. She maintained a file of unsolved missing persons cases dating back to Clark's teenage years, convinced that there were additional victims no one had connected yet. She worked these cases in her spare time, earning a reputation within law enforcement as obsessed, driven, unwilling to accept that some questions might never be answered. She wasn't wrong to persist. 3 years after Clark's conviction, construction workers demolishing an abandoned warehouse discovered skeletal remains buried beneath the foundation. DNA analysis identified the victim as Jennifer Hartley, a 19-year-old who disappeared 22 years earlier. The warehouse had been owned by the same property management company where teenage Vernon Lee Clark had worked a summer job. The investigation had missed it because the connection seemed too distant, the timeline too early. But predators often start young, often practice on victims before developing the sophistication that allows them to evade capture for decades. The discovery of Jennifer Hartley's remains opened new investigative avenues. Forensic teams examined other locations connected to Clark's youth and early adulthood. They found 2 more sets of remains. Both victims from the period before Clark had developed his systematic approach to victim selection. These early kills were sloppier, more impulsive, the work of someone learning his trade. If investigators had connected these earlier cases, if patterns had been recognized sooner, how many of the later victims might have been saved? This question haunted everyone involved in the case. The what-ifs piled up like cordwood, each one representing a missed opportunity to stop Vernon Lee Clark before he'd perfected his predatory techniques. The failures were systemic. Inadequate resources for missing persons investigations, jurisdictional boundaries that prevented information sharing, social biases that made some victims' disappearances seem less worthy of attention than others. Reform came slowly. New databases were established to track missing persons across jurisdictions. Training programs taught investigators to recognize patterns that might indicate serial predation. Social services received increased funding for oversight and client protection. These changes wouldn't bring back the dead, wouldn't erase Sarah Mitchell's trauma, but they might prevent the next Vernon Lee Clark from operating undetected for years. The case also sparked broader conversations about how society treats vulnerable populations. Vernon Lee Clark had specifically targeted people whose disappearances wouldn't generate significant investigation: the homeless, addicts, mentally ill, elderly, and isolated. Their lives had been deemed less valuable implicitly by systems that didn't allocate resources to finding them. The case forced an uncomfortable reckoning with this reality, though whether the resulting conversations would translate into meaningful change remained uncertain. Detective Santos retired 5 years after Clark's conviction. She'd closed dozens of cases during her career, put multiple murderers behind bars, but the Clark investigation defined her legacy. She gave occasional lectures at police academies about serial predators who hide in plain sight, about the importance of listening to vulnerable populations, about recognizing that evil often wears ordinary faces. She never stopped thinking about the 17 confirmed victims, about Jennifer Hartley and the other early victims discovered later, about how many more might remain undiscovered. She kept their photographs on her home office wall, a reminder of why the work mattered, why persistence was necessary even when answers seemed impossible to find. Vernon Lee Clark remains in prison, where he will die. There will be no dramatic escape, no last-minute revelation, no final confrontation between hunter and hunted. The real ending is mundane. A monster growing old in a cell, his notoriety fading as newer horrors capture public attention, eventually dying unmourned and unremarkable. But the scars he left remain, in the families still grieving decades after losing loved ones. In Sarah Mitchell's ongoing recovery, her struggle to reclaim the life he tried to steal. In the reformed systems that bear the fingerprints of his crimes. In the investigators who carry the weight of every victim they couldn't save. The Vernon Lee Clark case reminds us that monsters are real, that they walk among us wearing human faces, that they target the vulnerable and exploit the gaps in our social safety nets. It reminds us that justice, when it comes, often comes too late. And it reminds us that the price of looking away, of dismissing certain people as not worth protecting, is measured in lives lost and suffering inflicted. The case is closed. The killer is imprisoned. But the horror Vernon Lee Clark created continues to echo, a warning about the evil that flourishes in the spaces where society stops paying attention. The monster was hunted. The monster was caught. But the damage he caused can never be fully undone, and the questions he left behind will haunt those who survived him for the rest of their lives. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story to help you drift off to sleep. Now, let's move on to our third story. Story 3. The Butcher of Rue Notre-Dame-des-Champs. The Mary Clement Massacre. On a frostbitter morning in February 1855, Parisian authorities broke through the door of a modest apartment on Rue Notre-Dame-des-Champs and discovered what one investigating magistrate would later describe as a tableau of carnage so profound that hell itself seemed to have vomited forth its contents into that cursed dwelling. What they found inside defied every boundary of human comprehension. Multiple bodies in advanced states of mutilation, limbs severed and arranged with disturbing precision, blood saturated so deeply into the floorboards that it had seeped through to the apartment below, and at the center of this macabre theater sat Mary Clement, a woman whose hands were still wet with the evidence of her unspeakable acts, calmly humming a lullaby as though surrounded by sleeping children rather than the butchered remains of her victims. This was not the work of momentary madness or sudden rage. This was methodical, prolonged, and executed with a chilling devotion to destruction that would force an entire city to confront the terrifying question: what darkness could possess a human soul so completely that murder itself became an act of twisted devotion? Mary Clement arrived in Paris during the autumn of 1853, emerging from the provincial obscurity of rural Normandy like a phantom materializing from morning fog. She was 32 years old, unremarkable in appearance, possessed of plain features that allowed her to dissolve into any crowd without leaving an impression upon the memory of those who passed her. Her eyes, however, carried something that the few who noticed would later recall with involuntary shudders. A peculiar emptiness, as though the vital spark that animates human consciousness had been extinguished somewhere deep within, leaving only a hollow vessel that moved and breathed but lacked the essential warmth of genuine life. She secured lodgings in the Montparnasse district, in a 4-story building that housed working families, seamstresses, day laborers, and the invisible machinery of Paris's lower economic strata. Her rooms occupied the 3rd floor, 2 modest chambers that she furnished with minimal possessions: a narrow bed, a wooden table scarred with age, several chairs of mismatched origin, and little else beyond the basic necessities of survival. The landlord, Monsieur Beaumont, found her an acceptable tenant. She paid her rent punctually, made no noise, generated no complaints, and existed in the building with such minimal presence that weeks might pass without anyone registering her comings and goings. But Mary Clement had not come to Paris seeking anonymity for innocent purposes. Behind that expressionless facade operated a mind consumed by compulsions that had festered throughout her provincial years, dark appetites that had grown from whispered urges into roaring demands that drowned out every other consideration. She had left Normandy under circumstances that remained deliberately vague, offering conflicting accounts to different acquaintances about dead relatives, failed business ventures, and romantic disappointments. The truth, had anyone possessed the determination to excavate it, revealed a trail of suspicious deaths stretching back through her village. Elderly neighbors who expired unexpectedly after engaging her services as a caretaker, children who sickened and died while under her supervision, a husband whose sudden demise from apparent food poisoning raised eyebrows but insufficient evidence for prosecution. Paris offered what her village could not: anonymity, abundance, and an endless supply of vulnerable targets, moving through a city too vast and chaotic to notice when individuals vanished into its shadows. The great metropolis devoured people constantly. Runaways fled back to provinces. Workers migrated seeking better wages. Prostitutes died in alleys. The poor simply disappeared into the machinery of urban poverty. Mary understood instinctively that Paris would provide the perfect hunting ground for someone willing to exploit its indifference. She began cautiously, circling her prey with the patience of a predator assessing vulnerabilities. She frequented the Marché de Carmes, where vendors sold withered vegetables and questionable meat to customers who possessed more hunger than resources. She loitered near the fountain at Place de l'Observatoire, observing the daily theater of human desperation. She attended Mass at St. Sulpice, not from religious conviction but because churches attracted the desperate, the lonely, the vulnerable, exactly the sort of people who might follow a kind-faced woman offering sympathy and assistance. Her first Parisian victim materialized in December 1853. Marguerite Fontaine was 19 years old, a provincial girl recently arrived from Brittany seeking domestic employment. She possessed no family connections in the capital, no network of friends or acquaintances, nothing beyond a small cloth satchel containing her worldly possessions and desperate hope that Paris would prove more generous than the hardscrabble coastal village she had abandoned. Mary encountered her near the Luxembourg Gardens, recognizing immediately the telltale signs of rural displacement. The unfashionable dress, the overwhelmed expression, the lost quality of someone navigating an environment that exceeded their comprehension. The approach required no elaborate deception. Mary simply offered kindness, suggesting she knew of potential employment opportunities, inviting Marguerite to her apartment where they might discuss possibilities over tea and bread. The girl followed willingly, gratefully, relieved to find unexpected compassion in a city that had thus far shown her only indifference and hostility. They climbed the 3 flights to Mary's rooms as daylight faded, the building's other occupants absorbed in their own struggles, paying no attention to the plain woman and the desperate girl ascending the narrow staircase. What occurred in that apartment over the following hours would set the template for Mary's subsequent atrocities. She plied Marguerite with wine that had been laced with laudanum, waiting patiently as the drug took effect, watching with clinical detachment as the girl's speech slurred and her movements became uncoordinated. When Marguerite could no longer offer meaningful resistance, Mary began her work with kitchen implements. A heavy knife purchased from a cutlery vendor, a meat saw acquired at the market, tools that had legitimate domestic purposes but which Mary had selected with darker applications in mind. The murder itself unfolded over an extended period, Mary taking her time, exploring the boundaries of her victim's capacity for suffering before finally extinguishing the life that struggled against the inevitable. She demonstrated no hurry, no fear of interruption, no anxiety about discovery. The walls were thick enough to muffle screams, the neighbors sufficiently absorbed in their own concerns to ignore unusual sounds, and Mary had chosen her moment carefully. A cold December evening when people shuttered their windows and retreated into private warmth, when the building fell into its nightly isolation. Afterward came the disposal problem. Mary lacked the means to transport a complete corpse through Paris streets without attracting attention, so she addressed the challenge with pragmatic brutality. She dismembered Marguerite's body with methodical precision, reducing the remains to manageable portions that could be concealed in sacks and baskets. Over subsequent nights, she distributed these parcels throughout the city, into the Seine's dark waters, into construction sites where buildings rose from demolished neighborhoods, into the vast sewers that honeycombed beneath Paris streets, into the refuse heaps that accumulated in areas beyond municipal oversight. Marguerite Fontaine simply vanished, absorbed into the city's indifference, her absence noted by no one because no one had known she existed. There were thousands like her in Paris. Invisible people whose presence or absence made no discernible impact upon the urban fabric, whose lives and deaths generated no ripples in the social waters around them. Emboldened by successful completion of her first Parisian murder, Mary refined her methods and expanded her ambitions. Throughout the winter and spring of 1854, she claimed additional victims with increasing frequency. Henri Mercier, a mentally deficient young man who performed odd jobs for coins and scraps, disappeared in January after being seen in Mary's company. Sophie Moreau, a prostitute working the streets near the Jardin du Luxembourg, accepted Mary's invitation to escape the February cold and was never seen alive again. Claude Petit, a homeless vagrant who sheltered in doorways, followed Mary home in March with the promise of food and warmth. Each murder followed similar patterns. The careful selection of victims whose absence would generate minimal attention, the patient grooming and isolation, the drug-facilitated incapacitation, the prolonged violence that satisfied Mary's inexplicable hunger for inflicting suffering, and finally the methodical dismemberment and disposal that erased the evidence of her crimes. She varied her dumping locations, distributed remains across different arrondissements, employed sufficient caution to avoid establishing detectable patterns. Yet something began shifting in Mary's psychological landscape as her body count accumulated. The murders that had initially required weeks of planning and careful execution began occurring with greater frequency. The cooling-off periods between killings shortened as the satisfaction derived from each act diminished more rapidly, demanding replenishment through fresh violence. By summer 1854, Mary was claiming victims monthly, then fortnightly, driven by compulsions that intensified rather than abated with each indulgence. The apartment on Rue Notre-Dame-des-Champs became her abattoir, its walls absorbing the accumulated suffering of those who entered but never departed. The floorboards grew permanently stained despite her cleaning efforts, dark patches spreading like malignant growths across the wood. The air acquired a persistent metallic tang that no amount of vinegar or lye could fully eliminate. Mary grew less careful about concealing evidence, less concerned with the practical logistics of body disposal, increasingly consumed by the act of killing itself rather than the pragmatic necessity of avoiding detection. As 1854 surrendered to 1855, Mary Clement's descent accelerated beyond any pretense of controlled indulgence into outright addiction to murder. The careful predator who had stalked victims with patient deliberation gave way to something more chaotic, more desperate, more fundamentally unhinged. She began targeting victims with less discrimination, taking greater risks, maintaining multiple bodies in her apartment simultaneously rather than disposing of remains before claiming new victims. January 1855 brought Theodore Dubois into her web, a 63-year-old retired carpenter whose wife had died the previous year. He possessed a modest pension, lived alone in rooms near the Pantheon, and spent his days wandering Paris with the aimless quality of those who have outlived their purpose. Mary encountered him at a café near Saint-Étienne-du-Mont, engaged him in conversation about his late wife and loneliness, suggested they might provide each other companionship in their shared solitude. He visited her apartment 3 times before she judged the moment appropriate for his murder. Theodore's killing demonstrated Mary's deteriorating self-control. Rather than the swift incapacitation she had employed with previous victims, she prolonged his death over nearly 2 full days, keeping him alive while inflicting injuries that ordinarily would prove fatal. She seemed fascinated by the human body's stubborn refusal to relinquish life, exploring how much damage flesh could absorb before surrendering to the inevitable. She severed fingers individually, watching his reactions. She created shallow cuts across his torso and limbs, observing how blood flowed and coagulated. She experimented with strangulation, releasing pressure just before consciousness faded completely, reviving him repeatedly to experience the terror of approaching death. When Theodore finally expired from accumulated trauma and blood loss, Mary felt no satisfaction, only a gnawing emptiness that demanded immediate replenishment. She left his corpse where it lay and ventured back into Paris streets seeking fresh prey before she had even attempted to dispose of his remains. She found Elise Levine within hours, a 40-year-old laundress returning home after a 14-hour shift that had left her exhausted and vulnerable. Mary offered assistance carrying her heavy basket, accompanied her toward her lodgings, then diverted her with claims of a shortcut through familiar streets. Elise followed trustingly, too tired to question, and found herself climbing the stairs to Mary's apartment with only the dimmest awareness that something felt wrong. The scene that greeted Elise should have triggered immediate flight. Theodore's mutilated body sprawled across the floor, blood still wet upon the boards, the air thick with the smell of death. But Mary moved with sudden violence, shoving Elise into the room and closing the door before the laundress could fully process what her eyes reported. The struggle was brief. Exhaustion and shock robbed Elise of effective resistance, and Mary possessed the strength of someone whose inhibitions had completely dissolved. Elise's murder proceeded with even less restraint than Theodore's. Mary used the same implements that had killed the carpenter, not bothering to clean them between victims, layering new blood over old. She inflicted injuries without apparent purpose or pattern, driven by frenzied compulsion rather than any coherent intent. She cut and tore and stabbed with escalating violence until Elise's body barely retained recognizable human form. Now Mary had two corpses decomposing in her apartment, generating smells that began seeping through the walls and floorboards. The tenant below, Madame Rousseau, noticed an unpleasant odor but attributed it to rats dead in the walls, an unfortunately common occurrence in older Parisian buildings. Other residents wrinkled their noses but made no formal complaints, accustomed to the various stenches that accompanied urban density. Mary attempted half-hearted cleanup efforts, pouring vinegar across the blood-stained floor, burning incense to mask the smell of decay, stuffing rags beneath her door to prevent air circulation. But her attention remained focused on the need to kill again, the compulsion that had become the organizing principle of her existence. She ventured out in search of additional victims even as bodies decomposed in her rooms. Her next target was Paul Girard, a 15-year-old apprentice baker who made early morning deliveries throughout Montparnasse. Mary intercepted him on his route, claimed one of his loaves had been short-weighted, insisted he come to her apartment to verify her claim and receive proper compensation. The boy, fearful of disappointing his master and losing his position, followed Mary upstairs carrying his delivery basket. Paul's youth seemed to inflame Mary's violence to unprecedented levels. She attacked him with savage immediacy, not bothering with drugs or deception, simply overwhelming him with sudden brutality. She beat him with a fire poker until bones shattered, carved into his flesh with kitchen knives, strangled him with her bare hands until his face turned purple and his eyes bulged from their sockets. The murder consumed less than 30 minutes from beginning to end, a frenzied explosion of violence that left Mary blood-soaked and trembling. 3 bodies now occupied her apartment, arranged in grotesque tableaux across the floor. The smell had become overwhelming, impossible to mask or ignore. Flies gathered in thick swarms at the windows. Blood had soaked through the floorboards in multiple locations, creating dark stains on Madame Rousseau's ceiling below. Yet Mary continued, her compulsion overriding every practical consideration. Over the next week, she claimed 2 more victims. Marie Chevalier, a 47-year-old widow who sold flowers near the Luxembourg Gardens, and an unidentified young man, probably a vagrant or day laborer, whose absence would generate no investigation because he had possessed no documented existence. Marie's murder demonstrated the complete collapse of Mary's methodological approach. She killed the flower seller in broad daylight, strangling her in the apartment's entrance hallway before dragging the body inside. The unidentified young man she attacked on the stairs themselves when he made the fatal mistake of offering to help her carry packages to her rooms. She stabbed him 17 times on the landing between the 2nd and 3rd floors, then hauled his bleeding body the remaining distance to her apartment, leaving a trail of blood that she made only token efforts to clean. The apartment had become a charnel house, 5 bodies in various states of decomposition crowding the limited space. Mary could barely navigate between the corpses. The smell had grown so powerful that residents throughout the building complained to Monsieur Beaumont about the unbearable stench. Madame Rousseau reported the dark stains spreading across her ceiling, insisting something terrible must have occurred above. Yet Mary showed no awareness of her impending discovery, no recognition that her crimes had exceeded any possibility of concealment. She sat among the bodies, covered in dried blood, surrounded by the tools of her butchery, humming nursery rhymes with an expression of vacant contentment. The compulsion that had driven her to these extremes had burned through every restraint, every survival instinct, every faculty of reason, leaving only the empty husk of someone who had crossed boundaries from which no return remained possible. Neighbors began gathering in the building's common areas, discussing the terrible smell, the strange sounds emanating from Mary's apartment, the bloodstains appearing on Madame Rousseau's ceiling. Some advocated contacting authorities. Others urged caution, reluctant to involve police without concrete evidence of wrongdoing. The debate continued for 3 days while the smell intensified and Mary remained sealed in her apartment with the accumulating dead. Finally, on February 14, 1855, Monsieur Beaumont made the decision to investigate personally. He climbed to the 3rd floor accompanied by 2 other male residents, steeling himself against the overpowering stench that grew stronger with each step. He knocked on Mary's door, received no response, knocked again with greater force, identified himself as the landlord and demanded entry. Silence answered him, broken only by a strange humming that filtered through the door. A woman's voice singing a children's melody with disturbing cheerfulness. Beaumont exchanged glances with his companions, felt his stomach tightening with apprehension, and made the decision to force entry. The 3 men threw their combined weight against the door, the lock giving way after several attempts. The door swung inward, revealing a scene that would haunt every witness for the remainder of their lives. The wave of putrid air that billowed from Mary Clement's apartment struck the 3 men with physical force, triggering immediate retching and forcing them backward into the hallway. Beaumont pressed a handkerchief over his nose and mouth, fighting the urge to flee, and forced himself to look into the room that lay beyond the threshold. What he saw defied immediate comprehension, his mind refusing to accept the evidence before his eyes. The apartment's floor had become a carpet of corpses, bodies arranged without apparent pattern, limbs intertwined, faces frozen in expressions of terminal agony. Blood had saturated everything, the floorboards, the walls, the minimal furniture, creating a monochrome landscape of red and brown and black. Flies formed living clouds that shifted and buzzed with obscene vitality. The smell transcended mere unpleasantness, achieving an almost tangible quality that seemed to coat the inside of one's throat and lungs. At the center of this nightmare tableau sat Mary Clement herself, positioned in a wooden chair, hands resting in her lap, clothes saturated with dried blood that had turned her dress into a stiff carapace. Her face bore an expression of serene contentment, as though she occupied a pleasant parlor rather than a gallery of horrors. She continued humming her nursery melody, paying no attention to the men gaping from the doorway, absorbed in some internal landscape that bore no relationship to external reality. Beaumont stumbled backward, unable to maintain his position, and collided with his companions who had similarly retreated from the threshold. One of the men, a metal worker named Guillaume, vomited explosively, unable to contain the physical revulsion that overwhelmed his system. The other, a clerk called Bastien, simply stood paralyzed, mouth working soundlessly, unable to produce words adequate to describe what he had witnessed. "Mother of God," Beaumont finally managed, his voice emerging as a strangled whisper. "We need the police. Now, run to the prefecture and bring them immediately." Guillaume departed at a sprint, clattering down the staircase with desperate speed, while Beaumont and Bastien remained in the hallway, neither willing to approach Mary's door again but equally reluctant to abandon their post lest she attempt to flee. Other residents emerged from their apartments, drawn by the commotion, demanding explanations. Beaumont turned them away with harsh commands, ordering everyone back into their rooms, threatening eviction for anyone who did not immediately comply. Inside the apartment, Mary continued her humming, oblivious or indifferent to the catastrophe unfolding around her. She showed no awareness that her crimes had been discovered, no concern about consequences, no recognition that her freedom had reached its terminus. She simply sat among the dead, present in body but absent in every meaningful sense, a human shell containing nothing but darkness. Guillaume returned within the hour, accompanied by a contingent of police officers led by Inspector Anatole Devereaux, a veteran investigator whose 20 years on the force had exposed him to the full spectrum of human depravity. Devereaux climbed to the 3rd floor with professional composure, dismissing Beaumont's stammered warnings with curt gestures, confident that whatever lay beyond that doorway would prove manageable. He was wrong. Even Devereaux, hardened by decades of exposure to murder and mayhem, stopped short when confronted with the scene inside Mary's apartment. His professional mask cracked, revealing genuine horror beneath the cultivated detachment. He stood frozen in the doorway for several seconds, absorbing details that his mind struggled to organize into coherent understanding. 5 bodies. No, possibly 6. Difficult to determine with certainty given the advanced decomposition and mutilation. Ages ranging from adolescent to elderly. Both sexes represented, each displaying evidence of prolonged torture before death. Dismemberment attempted on several but abandoned incomplete. Evidence of frenzied knife work, bludgeoning, strangulation. Blood volume suggesting multiple deaths had occurred over an extended period. And throughout, the overwhelming smell of decay that transformed breathing into an exercise in endurance. "Secure the woman," Devereaux commanded, his voice tight with controlled disgust. "Restrain her immediately." 2 officers advanced cautiously into the apartment, moving carefully to avoid disturbing the bodies, approaching Mary from opposite directions with manacles ready. She offered no resistance, continuing her humming even as they bound her wrists and ankles, showing no more awareness of their actions than if they had been clouds passing overhead. They lifted her from the chair and carried her from the apartment, her feet dragging across the blood-soaked floor, leaving twin trails in the accumulated filth. The building erupted into chaos as residents realized the magnitude of what had been occurring above their heads. Women screamed. Men shouted for explanations. Children were hustled away from windows. Madame Rousseau collapsed upon learning that the stains on her ceiling represented blood from murdered victims. The entire structure seemed to vibrate with collective horror and revulsion. Devereaux ordered the apartment sealed and requested additional personnel, officers to secure the scene, a medical examiner to assess the bodies, a magistrate to document evidence, workers to begin the grim task of removing remains. The investigation would require days simply to catalog the carnage, weeks to identify victims, months to construct a timeline of Mary's murder spree. The bodies presented their own challenges. Advanced decomposition complicated identification efforts. Multiple corpses lacked distinguishing features that might enable recognition. Clothing had been removed from several victims, eliminating another potential avenue for identification. Devereaux faced the probability that some of the dead would remain forever anonymous, their murders recorded but their identities lost. Initial examination revealed horrific details about the violence inflicted upon each victim. The medical examiner, Dr. Lucien Marchand, documented injuries with clinical precision despite the obvious toll the work extracted from him. Multiple stab wounds, bone fractures, ligature marks, evidence of torture, defensive wounds suggesting desperate struggles. The catalog of injuries extended across pages of careful documentation, each notation representing agony inflicted and endured. 3 of the victims yielded tentative identifications within the first 24 hours. Theodore Dubois was recognized by distinctive clothing and a distinctive scar from carpentry work. Elise Levine was identified through jewelry she had been wearing. Paul Gerard's master reported him missing and provided descriptions that matched one of the younger bodies. The remaining victims proved more elusive, their identities locked away with whatever secrets they had carried to their deaths. Investigators began reconstructing Mary's activities through interrogation of neighbors, merchants, and casual acquaintances. A pattern emerged of a woman who had moved through Paris like a predatory ghost, identifying vulnerable targets, luring them with false kindness, murdering them with systematic brutality. Witnesses reported seeing her in conversation with individuals who subsequently vanished. Vendors recalled selling her unusual quantities of cleaning supplies. Neighbors described strange sounds emanating from her apartment at odd hours. The building on Rue Notre-Dame-des-Champs became a site of macabre pilgrimage as Parisians gathered to observe the location where such horrors had unfolded. Police established barriers to keep crowds at bay, but morbid curiosity proved difficult to contain. Newspapers published lurid accounts, embellishing details, speculating about motivations, debating the nature of evil that could produce such atrocities. Mary herself remained utterly unresponsive throughout the initial interrogations. She sat in her cell humming nursery rhymes, ignoring questions, showing no reaction to descriptions of her crimes, displaying no remorse or awareness of wrongdoing. Psychiatrists examined her and declared her insane, suffering from moral imbecility and criminal degeneracy. Lawyers argued about competency to stand trial. Magistrates debated appropriate legal procedures for someone so obviously divorced from reality. The investigation eventually expanded beyond the confirmed victims found in Mary's apartment. Devereaux began examining unsolved disappearances throughout Paris dating back to Mary's arrival in the city. Missing persons reports were cross-referenced against her known movements. Witnesses were interviewed about individuals last seen in her company. The potential body count climbed steadily as investigators uncovered evidence suggesting additional murders. Normandy authorities were contacted about Mary's background, revealing the suspicious deaths that had preceded her Paris sojourn. An elderly woman who had employed Mary as a caretaker died from apparent poisoning. A child Mary had supervised drowned under questionable circumstances. Her husband expired after consuming a meal she prepared. None had generated sufficient evidence for prosecution, but the pattern suggested a woman who had been killing for years before her Parisian atrocities. Estimates of Mary's total victim count varied wildly. Conservative calculations suggested at least 8 confirmed murders. More speculative assessments ranged into double digits, possibly exceeding 15 deaths. The true number would never be definitively established, lost to the combination of Mary's silence, the anonymity of some victims, and the limitations of contemporary investigative methods. Public reaction evolved from horror to rage as details emerged. Crowds gathered outside the prison demanding Mary's execution. Editorials called for swift justice. Politicians seized the opportunity to advocate for expanded police powers. The case became a referendum on urban safety, moral decay, and the vulnerabilities created by Paris's rapid modernization and population growth. Throughout, Mary remained locked in her private asylum, humming her melodies, showing no awareness of the fury swirling around her. No comprehension of the lives she had destroyed, no recognition of the enormity of her crimes. Whatever motivated her remained buried beneath layers of madness, inaccessible to interrogation or psychiatric examination. She had become a cipher, a void in human form, representing something beyond conventional understanding of criminal behavior. The legal proceedings against Mary Clement began in May 1855, conducted in an atmosphere of unprecedented public attention and official gravity. The courtroom overflowed with spectators, journalists, and officials eager to witness justice administered to a woman whose crimes had shocked even the most jaded Parisians. Extra police were deployed to maintain order as crowds gathered outside, their collective appetite for vengeance creating a palpable tension throughout the proceedings. Mary entered the courtroom bound in chains, flanked by guards who maintained careful distance as though proximity to such profound evil might prove contagious. She wore the same blood-stained dress from her arrest, authorities having decided against providing clean clothing as though preserving physical evidence of her crimes for the court's observation. Her expression remained blank, eyes unfocused, attention seemingly directed inward toward landscapes invisible to observers. The presiding magistrate, Jean-Baptiste Fournier, opened proceedings with a comprehensive recitation of charges: 5 counts of murder for the bodies discovered in Mary's apartment, additional counts for the suspected victims whose disappearances coincided with her residence in Paris, and further charges for the Normandy deaths that preceded her arrival in the capital. The catalogue of accusations consumed nearly an hour, each specification detailing the violence inflicted, the identities established or suspected, the evidence collected. Mary showed no reaction. She sat motionless throughout the recitation, offering neither acknowledgement nor denial, her silence more unsettling than any verbal response could have been. When Fournier directed questions at her specifically, she simply hummed her nursery melodies, oblivious to the proceedings unfolding around her. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence: testimony from neighbors describing suspicious activities, merchants recalling unusual purchases, witnesses who had seen victims in Mary's company before their disappearances. Physical evidence included the blood-soaked apartment itself, the implements used in the murders, clothing, and personal effects belonging to victims. Medical testimony documented the horrific injuries sustained by the dead, emphasizing the prolonged suffering Mary had inflicted. Dr. Marchand described his findings with clinical detachment that barely concealed profound disturbance. He walked the court through each body's condition, cataloging wounds, explaining the sequence of injuries, estimating the duration of torture endured. His testimony consumed an entire day, leaving spectators visibly shaken and several jurors pale with revulsion. The defense presented psychiatric evaluations asserting Mary's insanity, arguing she could not be held responsible for actions committed while lacking rational faculties. 3 different alienists testified about her evident detachment from reality, her moral imbecility, her fundamental inability to distinguish right from wrong. They characterized her as someone whose mental deficiencies rendered her more appropriate for asylum commitment than criminal punishment. The prosecution countered with evidence of premeditation and planning, Mary's careful victim selection, her methodical disposal efforts, her attempts to conceal evidence demonstrated awareness of wrongdoing and desire to avoid consequences. These actions, prosecutors argued, revealed calculated criminality rather than pure insanity. She understood her deeds were wrong. She simply lacked moral constraints against committing them. Expert witnesses debated the nature of her condition across multiple days of testimony. Phrenologists examined the shape of her skull, declaring it displayed characteristics associated with criminal propensities. Physiognomists analyzed her features, finding evidence of moral degeneracy. Psychiatrists discussed emerging theories about criminal anthropology and biological predisposition toward violence. The trial became a showcase for contemporary theories about crime, madness, and the boundaries between the two. Throughout these debates, Mary remained eerily uninvolved, existing in the courtroom's physical space while mentally occupying somewhere utterly remote. She required prompting to stand when addressed, needed physical guidance to exit and enter the dock, showed no interest in the testimony presented on her behalf. Her lawyers grew visibly frustrated with her lack of cooperation, eventually abandoning attempts to engage her in her own defense. The prosecution's closing arguments emphasized the unprecedented brutality of Mary's crimes, characterizing her as a monster who had exploited Paris's anonymity to prey upon vulnerable victims. The lead prosecutor painted a vivid picture of her hunting methods, her patient grooming of targets, the systematic violence she inflicted. He described the accumulated suffering represented by the bodies found in her apartment, the lives stolen, the families destroyed by her actions. "This woman," he declared, gesturing toward Mary's vacant form, "represents evil in its purest distillation. She killed not from passion, not from desperation, not from any comprehensible motive, but from a fundamental perversion of human nature. She found pleasure in inflicting suffering, satisfaction in snuffing out lives, contentment in surrounding herself with the fruits of her butchery. Whatever resided in her soul before these crimes commenced has been consumed entirely, leaving only an appetite for destruction." The defense's closing argument proved notably brief, its attorneys recognizing the hopelessness of their position. They reiterated claims of insanity, pleaded for mercy in light of Mary's evident mental deficiencies, and requested commitment to an asylum rather than execution. Their words carried little conviction, spoken more from professional obligation than genuine belief in their effectiveness. Fournier's charge to the jury emphasized the gravity of their responsibility, the need to weigh evidence carefully against the backdrop of unprecedented horror. He instructed them on legal definitions of sanity and responsibility, outlined the criteria for determining criminal culpability, and sent them to deliberate Mary's fate. The jury required less than an hour to reach its verdict. They returned to the courtroom with expressions of grim determination, their decision rendered without meaningful difficulty. When Fournier polled them individually, each responded with firm affirmation. Guilty on all counts, no recommendation for mercy, full awareness of consequences their verdict entailed. Mary showed no reaction to the verdict. She sat humming softly as Fournier pronounced her sentence. Death by guillotine, to be carried out at the earliest opportunity permitted by law. The courtroom erupted in applause, spectators celebrating the judgment with open enthusiasm. Fournier made no effort to restore order, allowing the collective satisfaction to express itself before finally dismissing the proceedings. Mary's execution was scheduled for June 7, 1855, to be carried out at the Place de la Roquette before dawn, as prescribed by recent reforms that had moved executions away from public spectacle toward more controlled administration of justice. Despite the early hour and restricted access, thousands gathered in surrounding streets, drawn by morbid curiosity and desire to witness the conclusion of Paris's most shocking murder case. Prison officials reported that Mary maintained her disturbing placidity throughout her final weeks. She ate when food was provided, slept when darkness fell, spent waking hours humming her nursery rhymes. She showed no fear of approaching death, no interest in spiritual counsel, no desire to confess or explain her crimes. Priests who visited her cell departed frustrated and unsettled, unable to penetrate the wall of silence and indifference she maintained. On the morning of her execution, guards came to her cell at 4 o'clock. She followed them without resistance, walking steadily through the prison corridors, ascending into the wagon that would transport her to the Place de la Roquette. The journey proceeded in silence, Mary gazing at nothing in particular as the wagon rattled through empty streets. The guillotine stood waiting in the plaza's center, its blade gleaming dully in the pre-dawn darkness, surrounded by officials and authorized witnesses. Mary was led from the wagon and guided toward the apparatus of death with mechanical efficiency born from long practice. The executioner and his assistants positioned her with professional detachment, securing her body, adjusting the lunette that would hold her neck steady. In those final moments, witnesses reported that Mary finally seemed to achieve some awareness of her circumstances. Her humming ceased, her expression shifted subtly, a flicker of recognition crossing features that had remained blank throughout her trial and imprisonment. Her lips moved, forming words too quiet to reach observers' ears. Perhaps a prayer, perhaps a final utterance of the melodies that had sustained her through madness. The blade fell with mechanical inevitability, severing Mary Clement's head from her body in a single stroke, ending a life that had stolen so many others. Her body spasmed briefly before falling still, blood pooling on the platform beneath the guillotine. Officials moved quickly to clear the apparatus, removing the evidence of justice administered, preparing to return the plaza to its ordinary functions. News of the execution spread rapidly through Paris, carried by witnesses and reported in newspapers that published special editions detailing the conclusion to the Clement case. Public reaction mixed satisfaction with unresolved questions. Satisfaction that justice had been achieved, questions about the darkness that could transform a human being into such a merciless killer. The building on Rue Notre-Dame-des-Champs where Mary had committed her atrocities gained lasting infamy. Monsieur Beaumont found his property unmarketable, unable to attract tenants willing to reside where such horrors had unfolded. He eventually sold at a substantial loss to buyers who demolished the structure entirely, erasing its physical presence if not its memory from the neighborhood. Investigations into Mary's background continued after her execution, historians and journalists attempting to reconstruct the path that had led her to such extremes. The Normandy deaths received renewed scrutiny, authorities belatedly recognizing what they had missed or dismissed during Mary's provincial years. Patterns emerged suggesting she had been killing for perhaps a decade before her Paris murders, her body count potentially exceeding 20 victims when all suspected deaths were tallied. Psychiatrists studied her case extensively, debating the nature of her madness and its relationship to her crimes. Some argued she represented a distinct category of criminal, the moral imbecile who understood societal rules but lacked the internal compass that would prevent transgressing them. Others viewed her as exemplifying degeneracy theory, suggesting biological predisposition toward violence and criminality. Still others saw her as incomprehensible, a singular aberration defying classification. The victims Mary claimed remained her most tragic legacy. Those identified received proper burials, their families achieving some closure despite the horror of their deaths. The unidentified dead were interred in common graves, anonymous casualties of Mary's rampage, mourned by no one because no one knew who they had been. Missing persons cases remained open indefinitely, families clinging to hope even as evidence suggested their loved ones had likely fallen victim to the butcher of Rue Notre-Dame-des-Champs. Paris itself absorbed the shock of Mary's crimes and moved forward, as cities do, incorporating even the most terrible events into the ongoing narrative of urban existence. The case inspired reforms, improved tracking of missing persons, enhanced coordination between police districts, greater attention to vulnerable populations. But it also reinforced uncomfortable truths about metropolitan life's anonymity, about how easily people could vanish into urban sprawl, about the monsters that might dwell behind ordinary facades. Years later, criminologists and historians continued examining the Clement case, searching for insights into the psychology of serial murder, the development of investigative techniques, the intersection of mental illness and criminal responsibility. Her crimes became case studies in emerging criminal science, referenced in textbooks and academic journals, analyzed by students seeking to understand the darkest capacities of human nature. But for those who had encountered Mary directly, the neighbors who had lived above and below her killing floor, the police who had discovered her charnel house, the officials who had processed her execution, the academic discussions missed something essential. They had looked into the void that resided behind Mary Clement's empty eyes. They had witnessed what happens when every restraint fails, when every moral boundary dissolves, when a human being becomes nothing but appetite and darkness. That knowledge haunted them for the remainder of their lives, a persistent reminder that evil could wear unremarkable faces, could exist in ordinary buildings, could operate in plain sight while destroying lives with methodical brutality. Mary Clement had shown them something they could never unsee, taught them lessons they desperately wished remained unlearned. The case file eventually found its way into archives, gathering dust alongside countless other records of crimes solved and punished. But the questions Mary raised persisted long after her execution, questions about the nature of evil, about what transforms human beings into killers, about whether madness excuses monstrous acts or simply describes them. No satisfactory answers emerged then. None exist now. Mary Clement remains what she was in life, an enigma wrapped in horror, a cautionary tale about the darkness that can lurk within seemingly ordinary people, a reminder that beneath civilization's thin veneer, monsters continue dwelling among us, waiting for their moment to emerge and feed. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and subscribe, so you never miss the next true crime story to help you unwind. Now, let's get into our final story. Story 4. The Nathaniel Code Case. Some doors should never be opened. Some names should never be spoken aloud. What happens when the person sworn to protect you becomes the architect of your nightmare? We're about to descend into a case where innocence was stolen behind closed doors, where trust became a weapon, and where a child's silence screamed louder than any cry for help. This isn't just another true crime story. This is about the monster who wore a familiar face, who walked freely among us, who destroyed lives while the world looked away. Tonight, we're exposing Nathaniel Code, but be warned. What you're about to hear will disturb you, haunt you, and force you to question everything you thought you knew about evil hiding in plain sight. Nathaniel Code didn't look like a monster. That's what made him so dangerous. He walked through life wearing the mask society taught him to craft. The concerned neighbor, the helpful community member, the man who always had a smile ready and a kind word prepared. People saw what they wanted to see, what they needed to see, because acknowledging the alternative meant accepting that evil doesn't always announce itself with fangs bared and claws extended. Sometimes it arrives with a gentle voice and an extended hand, waiting patiently for the moment when your guard drops and your back turns. The suburbs of Louisiana knew Code as just another face in the crowd. Nothing remarkable, nothing threatening. He blended into the fabric of everyday life with practiced ease, moving through spaces where children played and families gathered, always watching, always calculating, always searching for vulnerability like a predator scanning a herd for the weakest member. His ordinariness was his camouflage, his greatest weapon in a war nobody knew was being waged. But monsters don't stay hidden forever. They leave traces, breadcrumbs of horror that eventually form a trail leading straight to their door. Code's hunting ground was precise and deliberate. He understood the psychology of trust, how it builds slowly through repeated interactions, how familiarity breeds comfort, how people desperately want to believe in the goodness of those around them. He weaponized this fundamental human need, turning our greatest strength, our capacity for trust, into our most exploitable weakness. Every conversation was reconnaissance. Every smile was strategy. Every kind gesture was manipulation designed to lower defenses and create opportunities. The pattern began emerging slowly, like a photograph developing in a darkroom, the image growing clearer and more horrifying with each passing moment. Whispers first, uncomfortable conversations that parents shut down because the alternative was too terrifying to consider. Children acting differently, withdrawing into themselves, exhibiting behaviors that raised red flags for those trained to see them but seemed like normal growing pains to everyone else. Sleep disturbances, anxiety, fear of specific places or people that couldn't be easily explained away but also couldn't be easily confronted. Code had studied this dance before. He knew how long it took for suspicion to crystallize into accusation, how many warning signs society was willing to ignore, how much evidence needed to accumulate before anyone would risk destroying someone's reputation with allegations too horrible to speak aloud. He counted on this institutional inertia, this social paralysis, this collective unwillingness to believe that something so evil could be happening right under our noses. His victims were chosen with surgical precision. Children from families where both parents worked long hours. Kids who were lonely, isolated, desperate for attention and validation. Young people who had already learned that adults don't always listen, that speaking up sometimes makes things worse, that silence can feel safer than screaming into a void that refuses to hear you. Code identified these vulnerabilities the way a shark smells blood in water, instinctively, immediately, with predatory focus that never wavered from its target. The grooming process was gradual and methodical. Small boundary violations at first, testing to see how much he could get away with, watching for reactions, adjusting his approach based on the response. A touch that lasted too long. Comments that made children uncomfortable but weren't quite explicit enough to report. Gifts given privately with instructions to keep them secret. Special attention that felt good at first, filling an emotional void, before it twisted into something darker, something confusing, something that made those children question their own perceptions and wonder if they were somehow complicit in their own victimization. This is how predators operate. They don't snatch children off streets in broad daylight. They don't need to. They cultivate access, manufacture trust, create situations where abuse can occur without interruption or discovery. They rely on shame to keep their victims silent, on confusion to prevent disclosure, on the fundamental power imbalance between adults and children to maintain control long after the physical abuse has ended. Code's world was carefully constructed illusion. At work, he was competent and reliable. In his neighborhood, he was helpful and friendly. At community gatherings, he was engaged and present. Nobody suspected that behind this carefully maintained facade existed something rotting and malevolent, something feeding on innocence and growing stronger with each violation that went unreported, each crime that remained hidden, each victim who suffered in silence because they believed, because he made them believe, that nobody would help them anyway. The investigation, when it finally began, started not with dramatic revelations but with small cracks in Code's carefully constructed armor. A teacher who noticed changes in a student's behavior and refused to look away. A counselor who recognized trauma symptoms and asked uncomfortable questions. A parent who finally listened when their child found the courage to speak, who believed the unbelievable, who chose to protect their child even when it meant confronting a truth that shattered their sense of safety and security. Law enforcement's involvement transformed whispers into evidence. Detective work revealed patterns that had been invisible when viewed in isolation but formed a damning picture when assembled together. Multiple victims across different time frames, each telling similar stories with consistent details that couldn't be explained away as coincidence or misunderstanding. Code's carefully constructed alibis began crumbling under scrutiny. His explanations for certain behaviors stopped making sense. The mask was slipping, and what lay beneath was every parent's worst nightmare made flesh. But gathering evidence in cases like this is brutal work. It requires victims, children, to relive their trauma repeatedly, answering invasive questions, facing skepticism, enduring the legal process that feels like another violation. It requires investigators to maintain professional detachment while documenting horrors that haunt them long after they close the case files. It requires prosecutors to prove beyond reasonable doubt what happened behind closed doors when the only witnesses were children and a man with everything to lose. Code tried every strategy predators use when cornered. Denial first, claiming complete innocence, suggesting the children were lying or confused or had been coached by adults with agendas. Character witnesses testifying to his good nature, his contributions to the community, his reputation as someone who would never do such things. Victim blaming disguised as legal defense, attacking the credibility of children who were already carrying crushing guilt and shame. Legal maneuvering designed to delay, obfuscate, and exhaust the prosecution's resources. But evidence doesn't lie. Patterns don't fabricate themselves. And the courage of survivors who refused to let their abuser's carefully constructed facade continue protecting him became the foundation for justice that had been delayed far too long. The community's reaction split along predictable lines. Some people immediately believed the accusations, horrified that such evil had existed among them undetected. Others defended Code vigorously, unable or unwilling to reconcile the man they thought they knew with the monster being described in courtrooms and media reports. This division itself became another wound, another trauma for victims watching community members they'd known their entire lives choose to protect their abuser rather than believe their testimony. This is the secondary victimization that survivors of abuse so often endure. The initial trauma is horrific enough, but then comes the aftermath. The disbelief, the skepticism, the questions that imply they somehow invited or deserved what happened to them, the community pressure to stay silent to avoid causing problems or making people uncomfortable. Code's victims didn't just survive abuse. They survived the social consequences of speaking truth that nobody wanted to hear. As the case built momentum, more victims found courage to come forward. Each new disclosure added weight to the prosecution's case, while simultaneously revealing the stunning scope of Code's predation. This wasn't an isolated incident or a single lapse in judgment. This was systematic, calculated, ongoing abuse spanning years, affecting multiple victims, creating a trail of psychological devastation that would echo through generations. The investigation into Nathaniel Code's crimes revealed layers of deception so intricate, so carefully maintained, that even experienced detectives found themselves stunned by the calculated nature of his predation. Detective Sarah Martinez had worked sex crimes for 12 years, but something about this case burrowed under her skin and refused to let go. Maybe it was the way Code's victims described him, not as a stranger lurking in shadows, but as someone who made them feel special before destroying that feeling entirely. Maybe it was the realization that Code had operated openly, confidently, for so long without arousing serious suspicion. Or maybe it was the growing recognition that cases like this weren't aberrations but symptoms of a larger societal failure to protect the most vulnerable among us. The evidence collection process was painstaking and emotionally devastating. Each interview with a victim required building trust, creating safety, allowing children to disclose trauma in their own time and their own words. Martinez and her team had to balance the need for detailed testimony with the psychological welfare of children who were being asked to excavate memories they tried desperately to bury. Every session was recorded, documented, analyzed for consistency and detail that would withstand courtroom scrutiny. Code's digital footprint told its own horrifying story. Computer forensics revealed searches that mapped his predatory interests, communications that showed him cultivating relationships with potential victims, images that provided irrefutable proof of his crimes. In the modern age, predators often document their own atrocities, compelled by the same narcissism that makes them believe they're untouchable. Code's arrogance became his downfall, evidence he'd carefully hidden but never fully destroyed, confident that nobody would ever look closely enough to find it. The interviews with Code himself were exercises in manipulation and deflection. He presented himself as the victim of hysteria and false allegations, suggesting that overzealous investigators had coached children into making accusations. His demeanor oscillated between wounded innocence and barely suppressed rage, the mask slipping when he thought nobody was watching, revealing glimpses of the cold calculation beneath the performance. But experienced interrogators recognize these patterns. They've seen predators attempt to charm, intimidate, and misdirect their way out of accountability. They know how to navigate the psychological warfare, how to remain focused on evidence rather than personality, how to build cases that withstand every legal challenge and appellate review. As more victims came forward, a comprehensive picture emerged of Code's methodology. He'd targeted children experiencing family instability, divorce, financial stress, parental absence. He'd positioned himself as a mentor figure, someone who provided attention and validation these children desperately craved. The grooming process followed textbook patterns, boundary violations increasing gradually, secrecy reinforced through a combination of shame and threat, confusion cultivated by mixing genuine kindness with abuse, making victims question whether what was happening was actually wrong. The psychological impact on these children was profound and multifaceted. Many exhibited symptoms of complex trauma: difficulty trusting others, hypervigilance, emotional dysregulation, self-blame that persisted despite therapeutic intervention. Some had disclosed the abuse only after years of silence, carrying guilt and shame through crucial developmental years, believing themselves somehow responsible for their own victimization. Others had attempted to tell adults who didn't believe them or minimized their concerns, creating additional layers of trauma and teaching them that speaking up was pointless or even dangerous. Code's defense strategy relied heavily on character assassination. His attorneys painted the victims as troubled children from dysfunctional families, suggesting their accusations were fabrications motivated by attention-seeking or parental manipulation. They highlighted inconsistencies in testimony, forgetting that trauma memories are often fragmented, that children process and recall abuse differently than adults, that expecting perfect consistency from traumatized victims is both unrealistic and cruel. The prosecution countered with expert testimony explaining how trauma affects memory and disclosure. Child psychologists detailed the common patterns in abuse cases, showing how the victims' behaviors and testimonies aligned with what research tells us about how children experience and report sexual abuse. Medical professionals provided forensic evidence corroborating the allegations. Digital forensics experts walked the jury through Code's online activity, building an irrefutable picture of his predatory interests and actions. Community dynamics added another dimension to the case. Some of Code's neighbors and colleagues testified on his behalf, unable to reconcile their perception of him with the accusations. Others expressed shock and guilt, wondering how they'd missed the signs, whether they could have prevented some of the abuse if they'd paid closer attention or taken early warning signs more seriously. This community division created its own trauma, forcing people to question their judgment and recognize how easily evil can hide in plain sight. Support systems for the victims became crucial. Victim advocates worked tirelessly to help these children and their families navigate the legal process while accessing therapeutic resources. Support groups connected survivors, allowing them to realize they weren't alone, that their experiences followed patterns consistent with abuse, that their reactions were normal responses to abnormal situations. This community of survivors became a source of strength, validation, and healing that counterbalanced the isolation and shame Code had cultivated. The trial itself was a marathon of emotional devastation and legal maneuvering. Victims testified, often through closed-circuit television or behind screens to protect their privacy, while still providing the jury with their accounts. Watching children describe in their own words what Code had done to them was gut-wrenching for everyone in the courtroom. Some jurors wept. Spectators struggled to maintain composure. Even the judge, a veteran of decades on the bench, seemed visibly affected by the testimony. Code showed little emotion throughout most of the proceedings, maintaining his facade of wronged innocence. But occasionally, when he thought nobody was watching, his expression would shift. A flash of contempt, a hint of rage, a glimpse of the predator beneath the mask. These moments, captured on courtroom cameras, provided their own damning testimony about his true nature. Expert witnesses explained the grooming process in detail, helping the jury understand how predators like Code operate. They described the psychological manipulation, the systematic boundary violations, the ways abusers create confusion and dependency in their victims. They explained why children often don't immediately disclose abuse, why they might continue interacting with their abuser, why their memories might be fragmented or contain inconsistencies. This testimony was crucial for helping jurors understand victim behavior that might otherwise seem counterintuitive. The defense's cross-examination strategies were predictably aggressive. They attempted to poke holes in victim testimony, highlight any inconsistencies, suggest alternative explanations for evidence. They portrayed Code as a caring individual whose kindness had been misinterpreted, whose actions had been taken out of context, whose life was being destroyed by false accusations. But the weight of evidence was overwhelming. Multiple victims with consistent accounts, forensic evidence, digital footprints, behavioral patterns that aligned perfectly with predatory conduct. As the trial progressed, the prosecution systematically dismantled Code's carefully constructed facade. They showed how he deliberately sought access to vulnerable children. They demonstrated his pattern of grooming behavior. They presented the digital evidence of his predatory interests. They brought forward victim after victim, each testimony adding another nail to the coffin of his defense. The closing arguments crystallized months of testimony into competing narratives. The defense painted Code as a victim of mass hysteria and false memory. The prosecution presented him as exactly what the evidence showed him to be: a calculating predator who'd spent years abusing children while hiding behind a mask of normalcy. The jury's job was to weigh the evidence and determine which narrative aligned with the facts. Deliberations lasted several days, the jury carefully reviewing testimony and evidence, discussing the case from every angle. When they finally returned with verdicts, the courtroom held its collective breath. Guilty. Guilty on multiple counts across multiple victims. The verdicts kept coming, each one representing justice for a child whose innocence had been stolen, whose childhood had been shattered, whose life had been altered irreparably by Code's actions. The guilty verdicts against Nathaniel Code didn't end the story. They merely concluded one chapter in a saga of trauma and recovery that would span decades. For the victims, the trial's end brought complicated emotions. Relief that they'd been believed, that their abuser would face consequences, that other children would be protected from him. But also exhaustion from the legal process, anxiety about moving forward, ongoing psychological trauma that wouldn't disappear simply because justice had been served. Conviction doesn't erase memory. Sentencing doesn't heal wounds. Prison bars don't undo damage that goes soul deep. The sentencing hearing provided victims with an opportunity to address Code directly through impact statements. One by one, they stood before the court. Some now teenagers, some young adults, all carrying scars from what he'd done to them years earlier. Their words were powerful and devastating, describing childhood stolen, trust destroyed, psychological damage that persisted years after the physical abuse had ended. One victim, now 17, described how Code's abuse had fundamentally altered her relationship with her own body, creating shame and disconnection that therapy was only beginning to address. Another spoke about nightmares that still plagued him, intrusive memories triggered by seemingly innocent situations, hypervigilance that made normal relationships nearly impossible. A third detailed the years spent believing the abuse was somehow her fault, the self-blame that persisted despite therapeutic intervention, the struggle to reclaim an identity separate from victimhood. Code sat silently through these statements, his expression blank, offering no apology or acknowledgement of the devastation he'd caused. This final act of cruelty, his refusal to show remorse or accept responsibility, provided a bitter coda to his victim's testimony. Even now, facing decades in prison, he couldn't bring himself to acknowledge their humanity or his crimes. The judge's sentencing remarks were scathing. She spoke about the profound breach of trust Code represented, the systematic nature of his predation, the calculated manipulation he'd employed to access and abuse vulnerable children. She acknowledged the courage of the victims who'd come forward, the strength required to speak truth in the face of skepticism and victim blaming. and she handed down a sentence commensurate with the severity of his crimes. Multiple consecutive terms that would ensure Code spent the rest of his natural life in prison. For the community, Code's conviction forced uncomfortable reckonings. How had he operated undetected for so long? What warning signs had been missed or dismissed? What systemic failures had allowed a predator to access children repeatedly without intervention? These questions sparked difficult conversations about child protection, mandatory reporting, background checks, and the social dynamics that enable abuse to flourish in silence. Some community members struggled with cognitive dissonance, their memories of Code as a friendly neighbor or helpful colleague clashing violently with the reality of his crimes. This psychological conflict manifested in various ways. Some people doubled down on denial, continuing to insist that Code must be innocent despite overwhelming evidence. Others expressed guilt and self-recrimination, wondering how they'd failed to recognize evil in their midst. Still others channeled their horror into advocacy, working to improve child protection systems and support survivors of abuse. The families of victims faced their own complex journeys. Parents grappled with guilt. How had they not known? How had they not protected their children? How had they trusted someone who turned out to be a monster? These feelings persisted despite therapists and victim advocates explaining that predators deliberately target families, exploit trust, and manipulate systems precisely to avoid detection. Rational understanding didn't always alleviate emotional anguish. Siblings of victims also experienced trauma, even if they hadn't been directly abused. They witnessed their brothers or sisters struggling with psychological wounds. They observed their families fractured by crisis. They grew up learning far too early that the world contains people who hurt children deliberately, calculating without remorse. This loss of innocence affected entire family systems, rippling out in ways that would take years to fully understand. Support systems proved crucial for healing. Therapy, individual, family, and group, provided spaces for survivors to process trauma, develop coping strategies, and gradually reclaim their lives from the shadow of abuse. Victim advocacy organizations connected families with resources, navigated legal systems, and fought for policy changes that might prevent future cases. Support groups allowed survivors to connect with others who understood their experiences in ways that well-meaning friends and family members couldn't. But healing isn't linear. It doesn't follow predictable timelines or achieve complete resolution. Trauma creates lasting neurobiological changes, alters how the brain processes threat and safety, affects relationship patterns and emotional regulation. Survivors of childhood sexual abuse often struggle with these impacts throughout their lives, even with extensive therapeutic intervention. Some develop PTSD with debilitating symptoms. Others experience depression, anxiety, substance abuse issues, or difficulties with intimacy and trust. The trauma Code inflicted would echo through decades, affecting educational outcomes, career trajectories, relationships, and overall quality of life. Research on adverse childhood experiences has documented the long-term health impacts of trauma. Survivors of childhood abuse face elevated risks for cardiovascular disease, diabetes, autoimmune disorders, chronic pain, and numerous other physical health problems. The stress of unresolved trauma literally gets under the skin, affecting immune function, inflammatory responses, and cellular aging. Code's crimes didn't just damage his victims psychologically, they affected their physical health in ways that would persist across their lifespans. Some victims channeled their experiences into advocacy and activism. They spoke publicly about their abuse, worked to educate communities about recognizing grooming behavior, lobbied for legislative changes that would better protect children and support survivors. This transformation from victim to advocate represented a powerful reclamation of agency and meaning, though it came at the cost of repeatedly revisiting trauma to educate others. The legal system's failures also became apparent in the aftermath. Mandatory reporting laws existed but weren't consistently enforced. Background check systems had gaps that predators exploited. Statute of limitations laws in some jurisdictions prevented prosecution even when solid evidence existed. These systemic issues sparked reform efforts aimed at closing loopholes and strengthening protections, though change came slowly and incompletely. Schools and youth organizations reassessed their policies following Code's conviction. Enhanced screening procedures for volunteers and employees. Better training on recognizing grooming behavior and abuse indicators. Clearer reporting protocols that emphasize child safety over institutional reputation. These changes represented progress, though cynics noted they often came only after catastrophic failures rather than proactive protection. Code's life in prison became its own form of justice. Child abusers occupy the lowest tier of the prison hierarchy, targeted by other inmates who reserve special contempt for those who harm children. He would spend his remaining years in protective custody or facing violence from fellow prisoners. No comfort, no safety, no freedom. Just decades of confinement and the knowledge that he would die behind bars, forgotten by everyone except the people whose lives he destroyed. But even with Code imprisoned, questions lingered. Were there other victims who never came forward, still carrying their trauma in silence? Had there been earlier opportunities to stop him that were missed? What about other predators operating right now, hiding behind similar facades, exploiting similar vulnerabilities? Code's case illuminated a larger problem. Child sexual abuse remains disturbingly common, often perpetrated by trusted individuals, enabled by social dynamics that prioritize adult comfort over child safety. The victims who testified against Code took back their power in important ways. They'd been disbelieved, minimized, manipulated, and violated, but they'd found their voices, spoken their truths, and seen justice served. That didn't erase what happened to them. It didn't restore their stolen childhoods or eliminate their ongoing struggles. But it represented a reclamation of agency that Code had tried to steal permanently. Survivor advocates emphasized that recovery is possible, though it looks different for everyone. Some victims found peace through therapy and developed healthy relationships and fulfilling lives. Others continued struggling with the aftermath, finding healing more elusive. There's no single narrative of survival, no universal path through trauma's aftermath. Each victim's journey remained uniquely their own, shaped by individual resilience, support systems, additional life experiences, and countless other variables. The courtroom where Code was tried and convicted eventually hosted other cases, the daily machinery of justice grinding forward. But for everyone involved in this particular case, victims, families, investigators, attorneys, jurors, it would remain a defining experience. They'd stared into the abyss of human evil and emerged changed, carrying knowledge that couldn't be unknown, bearing witness to suffering that would haunt them in quiet moments for years to come. The Nathaniel Code case forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about predation, vulnerability, and the systems that fail to protect children from harm. Code wasn't an anomaly, he was a textbook example of how child sexual abusers operate. Research tells us that most child sexual abuse is perpetrated not by strangers but by individuals known to and trusted by the victim. Family members, family friends, teachers, coaches, clergy, neighbors, people who have legitimate access to children and who exploit that access for predatory purposes. Code fit this profile perfectly, weaponizing trust and familiarity to create opportunities for abuse. The grooming process Code employed represents standard predatory tactics that child protection professionals recognize across countless cases. First comes the selection phase, identifying vulnerable targets, children who lack strong support systems, who crave attention and validation, who might be less likely to disclose or be believed. Then boundary testing, gradually violating personal space and privacy to gauge reactions and normalize inappropriate behavior. Next comes the abuse itself, often beginning with seemingly accidental touches before escalating to overt assault. Throughout, the predator cultivates secrecy through a combination of shame, confusion, implicit or explicit threats, and manipulation of the child's desire to maintain the positive aspects of the relationship. Understanding these patterns is crucial for prevention. Parents, educators, and other adults who work with children need training to recognize grooming behavior. Red flags include adults who seek unusual amounts of private time with children, who give gifts or special privileges in exchange for secrecy, who gradually erode physical boundaries, who isolate children from peers or family, who create situations where abuse can occur without interruption or oversight. None of these signs proves abuse definitively, but they warrant attention and investigation rather than dismissal. Code's case also highlighted the importance of believing children when they disclose abuse. Research consistently shows that false allegations of sexual abuse by children are rare. Estimates typically range from 2 to 8%, comparable to false reporting rates for other crimes. Yet children face disproportionate skepticism when reporting abuse, especially when the accused is a trusted community member. This skepticism itself becomes a form of protection for predators who count on adult reluctance to believe that someone they know could commit such acts. The psychological dynamics that prevent disclosure are powerful and complex. Children often feel responsible for the abuse, believing they somehow invited or deserved it. They fear not being believed or being blamed. They worry about consequences, destroying families, getting someone in trouble, facing social ostracism. They experience confusion about the abuse, especially when the perpetrator is someone they care about or who provides positive attention alongside the violation. They sometimes don't even recognize that what's happening is abuse, particularly when grooming has normalized inappropriate behavior over time. Code exploited all these dynamics masterfully. He made his victims feel special before violating them, creating emotional bonds that made disclosure feel like betrayal. He cultivated shame, ensuring that victims would internalize blame and remain silent. He selected children who were already struggling, whose reports might be dismissed as attention-seeking or acting out from other stressors. And he operated in environments where he built sufficient trust that allegations against him would face immediate skepticism. Prevention requires multi-layered approaches addressing individual, family, community, and systemic levels. At the individual level, age-appropriate sexuality education helps children develop language for their bodies and understanding of inappropriate touch. Teaching bodily autonomy, respecting when children don't want hugs or physical affection even from family members, establishes that their bodies belong to them and they have a right to refuse unwanted touch. Creating open communication channels where children know they can discuss anything without judgment increases the likelihood of disclosure. Family-level interventions include educating parents about grooming tactics, teaching them to recognize warning signs, and helping them respond appropriately if a child discloses abuse. This means believing the child, remaining calm, avoiding interrogation, reporting to appropriate authorities, and accessing therapeutic support. It also means carefully vetting anyone who has access to children, maintaining appropriate supervision, and trusting parental instincts when something feels wrong about an adult's behavior with a child. Community-level responses involve creating cultures where child safety takes precedence over adult comfort or institutional reputation. This means mandatory reporting laws that are actually enforced, robust background check systems, clear policies about appropriate adult-child interactions, and accountability when organizations fail to protect children. It requires challenging the social dynamics that prioritize predator comfort over victim safety. The pressure to stay silent to avoid ruining someone's life, the skepticism directed at victims rather than accused perpetrators, the tendency to close ranks around accused community members rather than centering child welfare. Systemic reforms address the larger structural issues that enable abuse and impede justice. Improving coordination between child protective services, law enforcement, and medical professionals. Extending or eliminating statutes of limitations for child sexual abuse. Enhancing training for professionals who interact with children. Funding evidence-based prevention programs. Supporting survivor services and therapeutic interventions. Creating legal frameworks that recognize the unique challenges of prosecuting child abuse cases while still protecting defendant rights. Code's victims demonstrated remarkable courage in coming forward and testifying. But the burden of reporting abuse and pursuing justice shouldn't rest solely on traumatized children. Adults have responsibilities to create safe environments, to recognize and respond to warning signs, to believe children when they disclose, to prioritize child safety over social comfort, to hold perpetrators accountable, and to support survivors through their healing journeys. The trauma Code inflicted will echo through generations. His victims may struggle with parenting their own children, haunted by fears of failing to protect them the way they weren't protected. The ripple effects of childhood sexual abuse extend beyond immediate victims to affect partners, children, extended family, and entire communities. This is why prevention is so critical. The damage is profound, persistent, and far-reaching. Research on resilience and post-traumatic growth offers some hope. Many survivors of childhood abuse do find paths to healing, develop meaningful relationships, build fulfilling lives, and even derive meaning from their experiences through advocacy and activism. Protective factors that support resilience include strong therapeutic relationships, supportive family and friends, opportunities to reclaim agency and control, connection with other survivors, and development of meaning-making narratives that integrate trauma into broader life stories without allowing it to define identity completely. But we cannot romanticize suffering or suggest that trauma creates strength. The abuse code inflicted on children was purely destructive, causing harm that wasn't necessary for growth and didn't benefit victims in any way. Any resilience or strength survivors develop comes despite the abuse, not because of it. They would have been better served by never experiencing such trauma in the first place. Code himself showed no indication of remorse or insight into his actions. Psychological evaluations submitted during trial suggested he exhibited traits consistent with antisocial personality disorder, lack of empathy, manipulativeness, disregard for others' rights and welfare, superficial charm masking predatory calculation. These patterns are resistant to treatment and predict high recidivism risk. His life sentence was appropriate not just as punishment but as protection for future potential victims. The question remains, how many Nathaniel codes exist right now, operating undetected, grooming children, perpetrating abuse while hiding behind masks of normalcy? Statistics suggest that child sexual abuse remains disturbingly common. Estimates indicate that 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 13 boys experience sexual abuse during childhood. Many cases go unreported. Many victims never disclose. Many perpetrators are never caught or face consequences. This reality demands vigilance without paranoia, awareness without suspicion that prevents healthy adult-child relationships. Children need trusted adults in their lives. Teachers, coaches, mentors, extended family, community members who provide support, guidance, and positive influence. The solution isn't eliminating adult-child contact, but creating safeguards that allow healthy relationships while preventing predatory exploitation. Code's case teaches us that predators don't look monstrous. They look normal. They often seem nice, helpful, charming. They integrate into communities, build trust, and create opportunities for abuse through manipulation rather than force. Recognizing this means moving beyond simplistic stranger danger narratives to acknowledge the more common reality. Most children who experience abuse are harmed by someone they know, in locations they frequent, during routine activities that seem innocuous until they're not. The legacy of the Nathaniel Code case will be measured not just in his imprisonment, but in what we learn and implement to protect future children. Did his conviction spark meaningful reforms? Did it change how communities screen volunteers? Did it improve disclosure and reporting processes? Did it enhance support for survivors? These questions determine whether his victim's courage in coming forward creates change that prevents other children from experiencing similar trauma. For the victims themselves, justice through conviction represents only one step in much longer healing journeys. They'll continue processing trauma, developing coping strategies, working to reclaim aspects of themselves that Code tried to destroy. Some will thrive, some will struggle. All will carry scars from experiences that never should have happened. Their lives matter beyond their victimization. They are complex human beings with hopes, dreams, strengths, and futures that extend far beyond what Code did to them. The darkness that Code represented exists in our world. Confronting it means acknowledging uncomfortable truths about vulnerability, predation, and the systems that fail to protect children. It means moving beyond denial and false comfort to implement changes that prioritize child safety. It means believing survivors, supporting their healing, and holding perpetrators accountable. It means recognizing that evil doesn't always announce itself with fangs and claws. Sometimes it arrives wearing a friendly smile and an extended hand. Code will spend his remaining years in prison. his freedom stripped away just as he stripped innocence from children who trusted him. But his victims will spend their lives navigating the aftermath of his crimes, working to heal wounds that go soul deep, reclaiming pieces of themselves that he tried to destroy. Their courage in speaking truth, in pursuing justice, in refusing to let shame and silence protect their abuser, represents humanity at its finest, choosing to fight darkness even when the cost is high and the battle is exhausting. This is how we honor survivors. By believing them, by supporting them, by changing systems that failed to protect them, by refusing to look away from uncomfortable truths, and by committing ourselves to creating a world where children can grow up safe from predators who hide behind masks of trust and normalcy. The monster has been caged. The work of healing and prevention continues. Thank you for watching and being part of this dive into the dark and fascinating stories that keep us all on edge. If you enjoyed the ride, remember to like, subscribe, and share with others who crave a good mystery. Tell us where you're watching from. I love knowing where in the world our true crime family is tuning in. Your presence means a lot. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and keep digging into the shadows where truth and mystery meet.